6. Lift every voice. At the conclusion of the 1965 march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, in some ways the last great, unambiguous triumph of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr. stood before the Alabama State Capitol building, its Confederate flag flapping in the breeze, and recited the words of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Before he came to that famous peroration, however, he gave his fellow marchers a short lesson in a different chapter of American history, the origins of racial segregation. Where did this awful system come from, anyway? King's answer. It began, in part, as a stratagem to defeat populism, which had made a shocking bid in the 1890s to bring together poor blacks and poor whites into overwhelming majorities across the South. The leaders of this movement began awakening the poor white masses and the former Negro slaves to the fact that they were being fleeced by the emerging Bourbon interests. Not only that, but they began uniting the Negro and white masses into a voting bloc that threatened to drive the Bourbon interests from the command posts of political power in the South. The powerful, however, didn't fancy being unseated from their position of dominance in the South. To protect themselves, they tried to divide their working-class enemies, falling back on the old ruse of white supremacy. They saturated the thinking of the poor white masses with it, King continued, thus clouding their minds to the real issue involved in the populist movement. They then directed the placement on the books of the South of laws that made it a crime for Negroes and whites to come together as equals at any level, and that did it. That crippled and eventually destroyed the populist movement of the 19th century. What followed was one of King's all-time great images. The Bourbons, he recounted, took the world and gave the poor white man Jim Crow. And when his wrinkled stomach cried out for the food that his empty pockets could not provide, he ate Jim Crow, a psychological bird that told him that no matter how bad off he was, at least he was a white man, better than the black man. And he ate Jim Crow. That, King concluded, was the tragic story of how the original populist revolt was squashed. The masters of the South trashed their own society, set human against human in a racist death struggle, all to keep themselves secure in their exalted place. They segregated their world to death. They segregated Southern money from the poor whites. They segregated Southern mores from the rich whites. They segregated Southern churches from Christianity. They segregated Southern minds from honest thinking. And they segregated the Negro from everything. That's what happened when the Negro and white masses of the South threatened to unite and build a great society. A society of justice where none would prey upon the weakness of others. A society of plenty where greed and poverty would be done away. A society of brotherhood where every man would respect the dignity and worth of human personality. 1. It was a remarkable speech in many ways, not least because in this passage King got the broad sweep of the populist story right. By 1965 that word and that story had grown cloudy with demonization of the sort we saw in the last chapter. Indeed, before the decade of the 1960s was out, the media would crown as America's premier populist none other than King's nemesis George Wallace, the snarling segregationist who sat in the Alabama governor's chair at the moment King spoke. But for now that poisonous irony was still in the future. In 1965 idealism was still capable of carrying the day, and King looked back through the fog of confusion to recall how America's original movement of working-class unity was defeated. It wasn't just a historical point of interest for him. By describing populism's goal as a great society, President Lyndon Johnson's name for his civil rights and anti-poverty measures, King was suggesting that the movement of the 1890s had an obvious modern counterpart. Working people of both races could come together once more to build a nation of justice and plenty. What King hinted at, others stated directly. Michael Harrington, the Democratic Socialist author, was in the audience in Montgomery that day and set down the message for readers of the New York Herald Tribune on March 28, 1965. This movement was not going to stop with civil rights. King and the others made it clear that they look, not simply to the vote, but to a new coalition of the black and white poor and unemployed and working people, Harrington wrote. They seek a new populism. Harrington knew whereof he spoke. By populism, he meant a transracial movement of the working class that aimed to reform capitalism from the bottom up and distribute its wealth more evenly. Harrington was right to attribute such aspirations to King and his fellow leaders in the civil rights movement. He was also right to understand that a populist sensibility, stirred up by the successful struggle for civil rights, was sweeping over the country, building enthusiasm for participatory democracy, and popularizing catchphrases such as, power to the people. Consensus intellectuals had proclaimed, the end of ideology, just a few years previously, telling the nation that the big political problems had pretty much been solved. Mass movements were things of the benighted past. Today, the leaders of every group were seated comfortably around the boardroom table, and they got along famously with one another. Rationality and pluralism reigned, with stability and equilibrium for all. But now the men of consensus were rubbing their eyes behind those heavy horn-rimmed spectacles and gaping at what was transpiring outside the faux Gothic windows. There were millions of people in the streets, demanding an end to segregation and then to poverty, war, and sexism. There were students sitting in at lunch counters, cops unleashing dogs on protesters, Klansmen blowing up churches, and racists going mad on TV, dumping acid into the swimming pool rather than see it integrated. There were protesters surrounding the Pentagon, fighting the cops in Chicago, ransacking the dean's office. There were bomb threats and sometimes real bombs. There were consumer advocates and wildcat strikes and even farmer protests, all over again. Never has so cocksure a worldview seemed to crumble so completely so quickly. Today, Martin Luther King is far better remembered for his heroic battles against segregation than for his determination to humanize the capitalist system. But by the time of the Selma March, King was deeply immersed in workers' issues. He had spoken at many union gatherings, labor leaders had attended his marches, union lobbyists had helped get the Civil Rights Acts through Congress, and union members had donated heavily to King's organization over the years. The civil rights movement's various tactics, boycotts, sit-ins, mass demonstrations, were consciously borrowed from the labor actions of the 1930s. Before King became the country's preeminent civil rights figure, that role was arguably filled by A. Philip Randolph, president of a union of railroad workers. It was Randolph who first proposed a civil rights march on Washington, in 1941, and who helped organize the 1963 March for Jobs and Freedom at which King delivered his famous speech from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Asterisk. Emulating the labor movement, we in the South have embraced mass actions, King said to the National Maritime Union in 1962, boycotts, sit-ins and, more recently, a widespread utilization of the ballot. Martin Luther King Jr., All Labor Has Dignity, ed. Michael K. Honey, Beacon Press, 2011, page 70. The explanation for this relationship is simple. The labor movement and the civil rights movement were natural allies that shared similar goals and similar techniques. King returned to the point again and again in his speeches. Negroes are almost entirely a working people, he observed in his remarks to an AFL-CIO convention in 1961. There are pitifully few Negro millionaires and few Negro employers. Our needs are identical with labor's needs: decent wages, fair working conditions, livable housing, old age security, health and welfare measures, conditions in which families can grow, have education for their children, and respect in the community. That is why Negroes support labor's demands and fight laws which curb labor. That is why the labor hater and labor baiter is virtually always a twin-headed creature spewing anti-Negro epithets from one mouth and anti-labor propaganda from the other mouth. 2. The South had always been hostile to labor unions, but with the success of the civil rights movement, King ventured that would change. Help blacks secure their right to vote, he promised a gathering of the United Auto Workers, and a new day will dawn which will see militant, steadfast and reliable congressmen from the South joining those from the northern industrial states to design and enact legislation for the people rather than for the privilege. 3. Those last few words deserve our attention because they are a classic variation on the traditional populist formula. In truth, King used a lot of populist phrases. He spoke, for example, of the forgotten men, imprisoned in the ghettos of the big cities. He charged that America takes necessities from the masses to give luxuries to the classes. 4. King's great goal, to move beyond legal equality and secure democratic economic reforms as well, became especially clear in the later 1960s, when he advanced to what he called a new phase of the struggle. If the first phase was devoted to recovering citizenship rights, the next one was aimed at securing the economic equality that this country has never granted anyone without a fight. As the movement advanced to this next objective, King pointed out, many of its white allies would probably drop away. It had been easy for a certain sort of prosperous white American to support civil rights, he told an audience of Teamsters in 1967, when there was a simple objective of curbing brutality, of taming the coarse sheriffs of Birmingham and Selma. There was a dualistic clarity to those early struggles, with their brave stands against racist laws and pig-headed enforcers. Asterisk. Although King didn't mention it on this occasion, another factor bringing clarity was the international context in which those coarse sheriffs did their brutal thing. In the competition with the Soviet Union for the non-aligned nations of Africa and Asia, TV footage of police dogs attacking children in the streets of Birmingham made good propaganda for those denouncing the American way. But the next phase, King told his audience, would be different. It would carry a real cost for people outside the South, a cost that would be measurable in dollars. Demanding economic equality would mean massive federal appropriations to create jobs and job training. It means the outlay of billions for decent housing and equal education. Still, this war against poverty had to happen. Today Negroes want above all else to abolish poverty in their lives, and in the lives of the white poor. This is the heart of their program. To end humiliation was a start, but to end poverty is a bigger task. It is natural for Negroes to turn to the labor movement because it was the first and pioneer anti-poverty program. 5. Later that year, King began working on what would prove to be his final campaign. A poor people's march on Washington in which the marchers would remain in the capital city, living in tents and presenting their demand for what he called an economic bill of rights. The phrase itself was borrowed from Franklin Roosevelt, and King's logic was similar to the former president's. Ordinary political rights only took Americans so far. Now it was time for this prosperous country to guarantee its citizens a job, a minimum income, housing, and a decent education. His strategy was to recreate the protest of the Bonus Army, which had camped in Washington in 1932 while demanding payments for World War I veterans, and which, in turn, had been inspired by Coxey's Army, the 1894 March on Washington that had meant so much to the original Populists. 6. King interrupted his work on the Poor People's Campaign in early 1968 to make a fateful intervention in a strike of black sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee. In that particular city, the civil rights cause had morphed into a movement for workers' rights, and the going was as tough as it had been in Selma and Birmingham, with huge rallies met by martial law and plenty of police violence. The mayor of Memphis turned out to be as much of a hardliner against public sector unions as other Southern officials had been against integrated schools and black voter registration. In a powerful speech to the strikers there, King looked back over his career as a leader in the struggle for freedom and explained the move from civil rights to economic rights. With Selma and the Voting Rights Bill, one era of our struggle came to a close and a new era came into being, he recalled. Now our struggle is for genuine equality, which means economic equality. For we know now that it isn't enough to integrate lunch counters. What does it profit a man to be able to eat at an integrated lunch counter if he doesn't earn enough money to buy a hamburger and a cup of coffee? What does it profit one to have access to the hotels of our city and the motels of our highway when we don't earn enough money to take our family on a vacation? 7. King's statements on economic issues often reflected the thinking of his close associate Bayard Rustin, the political strategist who had helped put together the 1963 March for Jobs and Freedom. Rustin was the supreme pragmatist of the civil rights movement, by which I do not mean he was a lukewarm consensus seeker who believed that interest group lobbyists in D.C. could sort everything out. Like King, Rustin imagined big, bold things for the movement, for African Americans, and for the country, and he meant to achieve those things by means of clear-eyed left-wing realpolitik. A master of class analysis, Rustin believed in working through, as one profile of him put it, the ballot, the union card, and coalition politics. 8. Like King, Rustin understood that the movement had to advance to the next challenge after the landmark Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 65 had been signed into law. And so, in a much-discussed 1965 article in Commentary magazine, Rustin announced the transition of the civil rights movement from a protest movement, as he put it, into a full-fledged social movement, by which he meant a shift from removing the barriers to full opportunity to achieving the fact of equality. 9. Economic equality, that is. Rustin hoped to eliminate poverty in America with a massive federal employment and housing proposal called the Freedom Budget. The cost would be enormous. To achieve the goal, he wrote, would require nothing less than a refashioning of our political economy. Rustin well understood the political difficulties ahead. It is one thing to organize sentiment behind laws that do not disturb consensus politics, Rustin wrote the next year, and quite another to win battles for the redistribution of wealth. 10. How could he hope to bring such a gigantic change about? The answer is simple, deceptively so, Rustin continued. Through political power. How to take that power? Again, the answer was straightforward, by building a coalition of progressive forces which becomes the effective political majority in the United States, a coalition made up of Negroes, trade unionists, liberals, and religious groups. 11. Especially trade unionists. In the years to come, as Rustin drew closer to the AFL-CIO, he often wrote about the role of organized labor in building his grand coalition of economic reformers. As it happens, these were also the years when the stereotype of white union members as right-wing hardhats was coming together, which makes their central position in Rustin's plans even more remarkable. In 1970, union construction workers in New York City attacked and scattered a protest against the Vietnam War. A few weeks later they held a massive pro-war rally in the streets of Manhattan. In 1971, the archetypal blue-collar bigot Archie Bunker made his debut on television, yet, in the face of all that, Rustin published The Blacks and the Unions, in which he insisted that the unions of the day were in fact more integrated than nearly any other American institution, even with the reactionary construction unions taken into account. What's more, Rustin went on, unions naturally gravitated toward integration because they understood, after many hard lessons, that dividing the working class by race meant certain defeat. Most important, for Rustin's purposes, was that the union's political program was identical to the demands of African American leadership. The problems of the most aggrieved sector of the black ghetto cannot and will never be solved without full employment, Rustin wrote, and full employment, with the government as employer of last resort, is the keystone of labor's program. 12. In this way Rustin surveyed the same ground as other figures I have described in these pages, and ran into the same problem. Lifting up people crushed by centuries of racist exploitation meant not only winning the rights of citizenship but also reforming the capitalist system. Any structural reform along these lines was going to be costly, however, and this would make such change difficult. Moral suasion would not suffice here. The only way to get it done would be with a grand coalition of working-class people, a mass movement from the bottom up. Racism was, in addition to everything else, a deadly poison to that coalition, since it fatally undermined solidarity. Rustin also faced something new. The problem of liberal anti-populism, by which I mean the growing contempt of enlightened professionals for the lower orders, meaning the white working class. For well-educated liberals in the early 1970s, such people, along with their organizations, appeared to be the nation's single most reactionary element, supporting the war in Vietnam, resisting busing, putting Richard Nixon in the White House, and so on. Rustin would have none of it. After quoting a handful of condescending liberal remarks about union members, he came right to the point. This was not political opposition, but a certain class hatred. More specifically, it represented a hatred of the elite for the mass, the upper-class liberals. Of 1971, he continued, understood alienation rather than solidarity as the heart of radicalism, ignoring organizations of ordinary people that aimed by their very nature for greater social equality and distributive justice. 13. What surprises the disenchanted modern reader about all this is Rustin's optimistic assumptions about ordinary citizens. It's a theme that recurred throughout his career. Describing a voter registration drive in a 1958 letter to Martin Luther King, for example, Rustin wrote, "We urge people to vote. We do not want to influence them to vote for any particular party. We believe in the people. When they are aroused to vote, they will vote intelligently." 14. This optimistic thread ran all through the civil rights movement. I am a man. Read the placards carried by strikers in the Memphis sanitation workers' strike, an assertion of rights and equality as fundamental as anything we've seen in these pages. When King spoke to those men, trash collectors, remember, who came from society's lowliest ranks, he said, "So often we overlook the work and the significance of those who are not in professional jobs, of those who are not in the so-called big jobs. But let me say to you tonight, that whenever you are engaged in work that serves humanity, it has dignity, and it has worth." 1-5. All labor has dignity, King continued that night in March 1968. An expression that could have come straight out of a populist manifesto circa 1891. The most dynamic populist innovations of the 1960s came not from adults but from radical youth groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was formed after sit-in protests at segregated lunch counters in North Carolina in 1960. SNCC's leaders stood up to spectacular racist violence during the Freedom Ride campaign and then during efforts to register black voters in the Deep South, and their bravery quickly captured the imagination of liberals nationwide. But what made SNCC remarkable wasn't really its leaders, it was the group's determination to enlist ordinary African American citizens for direct actions against the racist system of the South. By ordinary citizens, I am referring, in many cases, to tenant farmers and sharecroppers, the same group that was the focus of so much populist activity in the 1890s and of populist culture in the 1930s. Traditional civil rights groups would typically build support for their agenda with a charismatic leader, but SNCC took a different approach. Its idea was to move into some area in the Deep South, which was still, 100 years after the Civil War, more of a giant carceral work farm for African Americans than it was a modern capitalist economy. Build a movement among the people who lived there, then continue to organize somewhere else. It was the organized, not the organizer, that mattered in this model. In its early years, SNCC was boldly and thoroughly anti-hierarchical, practicing democracy in its meetings as well as demanding democracy from the white masters of the South. The group insisted, for example, that ordinary people's knowledge of civil rights law was in some ways superior to that of law professors and lawmakers. It understood that, as one history of the movement puts it, experts and leaders did not know how to break down Jim Crow. Only the people themselves could do that, and so SNCC's object came to be, to create leadership in each community so that formal leaders would no longer be necessary. 16. SNCC's language was often straightforwardly populist. We all recognize the fact that if any radical social, political and economic changes are to take place in our society, the people, the masses, must bring them about, was one of the famous lines deleted from SNCC leader John Lewis' speech at the 1963 March on Washington. It's not radical if SNCC people get political offices, or if M.L. King becomes president, if decisions are still made from the top down, said SNCC leader Stokely Carmichael in 1965. If decisions get made from the bottom up, then that's radical. 17. Participatory democracy was the name the decade gave to the idea that motivated SNCC. The actual phrase was introduced by another student-led group, Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, the main organization of what was then called the New Left. To hear the group's leaders explain what they meant by PD, you might think you were listening to some latter-day adherent of the old People's Party, their red-hot Great Plains calamity talk having somehow been translated into the subdued language of the mid-century multiversity. As SDS's 1962 Port Huron statement explained, participatory democracy meant that decision-making of basic social consequence be carried on by public groupings. That politics be seen positively as the art of collectively creating an acceptable pattern of social relations. And furthermore, that big economic decisions should be open to democratic participation and subject to democratic social regulation. There was more to it, of course. Probably too much more. As political platforms go, the Port Huron statement was a wordy one, with the early printed versions running to some 63 densely argued pages. Suffice it to say here that participatory democracy eventually became one of the glowing desiderata of the era. Like authenticity, like revolution. A fad concept that students were all on fire to actualize. 18. A fad, yes, but also something genuinely hopeful. Participatory democracy arose from SDS's wildly optimistic first principle, that all humans were infinitely precious and possessed of unfulfilled capacities for reason, freedom, and love. It was succinctly stated in a later SDS slogan. Let the people decide. The echoes of populism in this kind of talk were obvious, if not always acknowledged by new leftists themselves. The reverence for the ordinary citizen, the longing for collective democratic action. And, of course, all of it flew straight in the face of the cardinal doctrine of modern anti-populism, that the people are far too ignorant to manage their own affairs. The other important way in which the 60s student left fit the populist profile was its transracial quality. Organizing across color lines was, obviously, close to the heart of what the new left thought it was. In the early 60s, SD-SERS enlisted in SNCC's campaigns for desegregation and black voting rights in the South, learning from them the power of direct action. In the late 60s they came to regard groups like the Black Panthers as the vanguard of the socialist revolution they meant to make. In both cases it was the militant black left that they looked to for leadership. This marks a change in the populist tradition, and its significance deserves to be underscored. For the first time, writes Michael Kazin, a historian of populism who was also an SDS leader at Harvard University, significant numbers of white activists proclaimed a desire to take their cues from a primarily black movement. 19. Generally speaking, populist movements of the past had involved white organizers including blacks in their movements. This time the equation was reversed. African Americans were the leaders. The white left was a sort of auxiliary to their insurgency in the South. Like its predecessors, the New Left was also a mass movement, or rather, it eventually became one. After 1965, as the Vietnam War became issue number one, the New Left exploded in size. At its zenith, SDS had around 100,000 members, small by historical standards, but with a cultural reach that far exceeded those numbers. Its ideas spread from the elite campuses to the vast world of college students, giving us the 60s, as everyone remembers it, constant protests, occupations of campus buildings, battles with police outside the Pentagon or the Chicago Hilton, Viet Cong flags, gigantic rallies on the Mall in Washington, D.C. By the end of 1968, however, nothing was working out the way it was supposed to. Martin Luther King was murdered less than a month after he declared that all labor has dignity, his assassination touching off riots in cities across the country. The Memphis sanitation workers eventually won their strike. Today they are AFSCME Local 1733, but the poor people's campaign floundered without King's leadership. The tent city on the National Mall was constructed as planned, but only after endless organizational difficulties and without ever achieving the spectacular impact of the 1963 March on Washington. The shift of emphasis toward economic equality planned by King and Bayard Rustin fared even worse. The Vietnam War absorbed all the resources that the Johnson administration, the last one led by a real New Deal liberal, might have put toward achieving full employment. Rustin's hopes for the freedom budget and a powerful left-wing political coalition were smashed in the process. Although it was hard to see it coming at the time, liberalism was smashed, too, its different factions pulling the Democratic Party to pieces. Organized labor never did recover the boldness of the CIO era, as Martin Luther King often urged it to do. Instead, most unions settled into bureaucratic torpor. King's plan for reforming the Democratic Party fared no better. As black voters made their numbers felt in the South, the racist political machinery of the region simply changed sides, defecting to the Republicans. The Democratic Party itself did the opposite of what the reformers hoped. Instead of embracing a bold agenda of redistribution, the party descended into a civil war in the wake of the Vietnam debacle. The winners of that tussle were ultimately the party's anti-populists, technocrats who believed that reforms, if any were warranted, had to come from the highly educated leadership class. As for the New Left, it failed to become the next step in the grand march of progress, always remaining a movement of college students, not the people. Its members never transcended their essential identity. These were proto-professionals, young people in training for positions in the upper reaches of America's middle-class society. They were a charming elite and even an alienated elite, but an elite nevertheless. 20. And they acted like one. In the early days of SDS, the group's understanding of capitalism didn't have a whole lot to do with traditional working-class concerns. With hard work for lousy pay, for example, or with monopoly, or with the power of banks. 21. Indeed, what made them a new left was the singular belief that educated people like them, rather than the working class, were now the agents of political progress. In this they bore a strong resemblance to the consensus intellectuals who taught them, scholars who believed progress would come from the enlightened people in society's higher educated ranks, not from mass movements or blue-collar workers. The key was not the proletariat, as socialists for more than a century had believed, as historian James Miller summarizes one SDS leader's thinking in the early days. The key was students, as Tom Hayden, the principal author of the Port Huron Statement, recalled years later. He had believed that humanity had entered a whole new period of history in which the left had to go from a belief in labor as the agency of change to students as an agency of change. 22. Social class was a persistent stumbling block for the new left. One anecdote Miller relates in his history of SDS is how the group's organizers, trying to bring together the unemployed in several northern cities, eventually lost interest in the poor folks they were trying to help, because those poor folks often turned out to think America needed to fight communism in Vietnam. 23. Let the people decide, and they will disappoint you every single time. Eventually, the romantic populism of the early 1960s drained away completely. It happened in movement politics and it happened in the larger culture. The 60s, as middle-class Americans remember it, began with a folk music revival, with 1,000 super-authentic performances of blue-collar despair. With the Ballad of Hollis Brown, and all those different versions of the sad, sad story of the House of the Rising Sun. The way it ended was with anger, with the Jefferson airplane yelling, "Up against the wall, motherfucker." By the time the clock ran out on the new left, its activists had come to believe that the American people were not the protesters getting fire-hosed by the police in Birmingham, Alabama. The American people were now seen as the ones turning the fire hoses on those protesters. The people were not the would-be beneficiaries of progressive reform. They were the enemy, facilitators of the evil American empire. Working people, here in the USA, were not anything special. In 1969, SDS manifesto declared, just another, particular privileged interest, bought off with imperialist plunder. The only people who mattered by then were the oppressed peoples of the world, the peasants of Vietnam and the Third World, and with them the white New Left boldly declared its solidarity. SDS was a revolutionary youth movement, now an armed ally of the global people's uprising in whose eyes all Americans, with the exception of African Americans, were suspect. 24. This, at any rate, was one of the movement's great, lasting legacies. The New Left succeeded in stripping the aura of nobility away from what the Pops called the producing classes, and in inventing an understanding of radicalism in which politics was no longer really about accomplishing public things for the common good. Instead, politics was becoming, at least in part, a path to personal fulfillment or healing. Protest degenerated into street theater. Radical style came to trump radical substance, as the historian Christopher Lasch put it. A satisfying sense of personal righteousness became the ultimate end of political action. 25. It was the opposite of what King and Rustin were after, what populism is always after, a grand coalition of social forces that would reform capitalism in the interests of the great majority. That was lost in the late 60s, drowned in the muddy Mekong or clubbed to the pavement on Michigan Avenue. I do not want to judge the New Left too harshly. I wasn't there. To those who were, the horror of the Vietnam bloodbath was overwhelming, and in bringing it to a stop, extreme measures must have seemed justified. Also, SDS was right about the exhaustion of liberalism, and they were right, in part, about the traditional institutions of the left. Liberals were indeed too cozy with corporations and with imperialism. Many unions were indeed bureaucratic and unprogressive back then. After all, there were no more solid supporters of the Vietnam War than the top brass of the labor movement. Not all working-class leaders were so hidebound, however. Walter Reuther, the president of the powerful United Auto Workers and a veteran of the CIO campaigns of the 30s, spent the 60s marching in civil rights demonstrations and looking for ways to join forces with the new left. He was slow to turn against the war, out of loyalty to President Lyndon Johnson. But in 1970 he was able to look back over the history of his union and claim, with justification, that no organization in the world had done more to place human rights above property rights. 26. This was an insight the protesters of that era missed. Organizations of ordinary working people are often a force for democratic progress by their very nature, regardless of the ignorance or bigotry of individual members of those organizations. The radicals missed the point then, and everyone misses the point today. The social stereotypes established in those last awful years of the 60s have stuck with us. Like the geriatric Rolling Stones, they chug along imperturbably though they are now decades past their rightful retirement. We cannot shake them. When we recall that King and Rustin and Walter Reuther hoped for a grand alliance of ordinary people, we have trouble imagining what they might have had in mind. But white working-class people as enemies of progress, oh, that we understand. The big counterculture think book of 1970, The Greening of America, described blue-collar workers as those arch-opponents of the new consciousness. This was stated matter-of-factly. The author assumed that everyone knew what he meant by then. The book's twist was that it exhorted us to have pity on these monstrous proles. Look again at a fascist, tight-lipped, tense, crew-cut, correctly dressed, church-going, and American flag on his car window, a hostile eye for communists, youth, and blacks. You might hate this stock blue-collar character, but his life is really quite sad. He has had very little of love, or poetry, or music, or nature, or joy. He has been dominated by fear. He has been condemned to narrow-minded prejudice, to a self-defeating materialism, to a lonely suspicion of his fellow men. He is angry, envious, bitter, self-hating. He ravages his own environment. He has fled all his life from consciousness and responsibility. He has turned against his own nature. And so on. Maybe all he really needs is to be slipped a dose of youth culture. 27. The Greening of America is dedicated to the students at Yale, where its author taught in the law school. That the stereotype the book did so much to bolster might have been a straightforward expression of his cohort's structural antagonism to working-class people appears not to have occurred to its author. In hindsight, however, it is obvious. In 1896 the young gentleman of Yale heckled working-class champion William Jennings Bryan. In 1970 their votary trolled the white working class generally for its lousy consciousness. And somewhere in between this myth was blithely cemented. The Ivy League elite were not only society's rulers, but also society's rebels and revolutionaries, its designated conscience. The successful were not only more capable than those who toil, they were morally superior as well. The reasoning had been flipped but the conclusion remained the same. The ruling class ruled because it deserved to rule. Think of the enlightenment that clouded the mind of the celebrated author Terry Southern, who wrote parts of the 1969 movie Easy Rider, another accolade for the counterculture, and who described its horrifying final scene as an indictment of blue-collar America, the people I thought were responsible for the Vietnam War. 28, which is to say, Southern thought the people serving in the Vietnam War were the people who got us into the Vietnam War. Hollis Brown and the Masters of War had turned out to be one and the same. And now think of that scene itself, the ultimate expression of the decade's anti-populist sensibility. Easy Rider, a motorcycle adventure movie starring and produced by Peter Fonda, has often been described as a generational answer to The Grapes of Wrath, which starred Fonda's dad, Henry. And in that final scene, the glamorous young bikers with the awesome rock and roll soundtrack are brutally and pointlessly shot to death by a pair of heavily accented, obviously impoverished rednecks riding in the cab of an old pickup truck. Who are these villains? As the sharp-eyed historian Jefferson Cowie points out, it is almost impossible to not see these characters as a quote from The Grapes of Wrath. 29. In other words, they were the Jodes, the very symbols of resilient 30s populism, reimagined for the 60s and for the decades to come as murderers. As pig-headed killers of everything that is fun and joyful and enlightened and tolerant and cool in American life. As fascists. In this way the consensus school's anti-populism was elevated by its enemy the counterculture into wisdom for the ages. The consensus view on nearly everything else, mass movements, post-ideology, the sanctity of the university, and so on, was shattered by the 60s, but this essential bit of class profiling was set in stone. Working-class whites were reactionary and authoritarian. The university president in his three-piece suit believed it, in his quiet, scholarly way. And so did the long-haired student who had just trashed his office and chugged his sherry. Democracy is a system meant for enlightened people like them. The 1968 third party run for the presidency by the Alabama segregationist George Wallace represented either the final confirmation of this thesis or a backlash against it, depending on your perspective. Touring northern cities as well as his familiar southern haunts, Wallace denounced hippies and journalists and Hollywood celebrities and liberal college professors, always from a position of long-suffering averageness. White working people from every corner of the nation briefly rallied to Wallace's message of hardscrabble anguish, his savage resentment of the high-minded and the well-educated. And so a man straight out of the Southern demagogue tradition came to be seen as an honest expression of the average American's new sense of bitterness. Populism was the noun journalists started using to categorize that Southern demagogue tradition. Thanks to the labors of Richard Hofstadter and the others described in the last chapter, writers everywhere knew that this was the exact word for Wallace's venomous combination of racism and his appeal to the great silent American folk, as one account put it. Besides, Wallace was said to be vaguely liberal on economic questions, and he was running as a third-party candidate. So the P word seemed to make sense, although Wallace apparently never used it to describe himself. Indeed, he objected to it. Journalists depicted him as the ne plus ultra of populism as he went about his mission of political disruption. 30. In retrospect, it was clearly a misnomer. Alabama was capable of producing left-wing, man-of-the-people politicians in the 1960s, but George Wallace wasn't one of them. Where populism had once been defined by its transracial aspirations, Wallace was the nation's champion segregationist, a mouthpiece for the very sort of people who terrorized actual populists in the 1890s. Wallace was no rebel. He was the authority under whom Alabama officers beat and hounded civil rights protesters so many times in the 1960s, perhaps the ultimate anti-populist act. 31. Nor was Wallace's snake oil much of a tonic for working people. The United Auto Workers, guardians of the flame of CIO populism, poured enormous resources into a campaign against him in 1968, reminding their members of how very little racism had achieved for working people in Wallace's Alabama. His economic concern for the little guy, they pointed out, was a total fraud. The Union campaign succeeded, beating back what had at first appeared to be a powerful Wallace surge in the industrial districts of the North. 32. But the P word stuck as a description for working-class reaction. And while it is perhaps an exaggeration to say that Wallace's sneering, upside-down populism defeated the hopeful, traditional version, it is undoubtedly true that the Alabama governor's characteristic set of grievances became a kind of checklist for generations of resentful politicians of the right. And it was in this way that the optimistic, liberal 60s ceded the stage to an angry counter-60s of the right, a pseudo-populism that honored ordinary, put-upon Americans who were fed up with all the protests and the revolution talk and longed merely for law, order, and a little respect for old glory. One of the earliest converts to this new sensibility was none other than Richard Hofstadter, the historian who had spent his career assailing the original populists, and constructing the definition that scholars and journalists use today. The particular ivied fortress from which Hofstadter had lobbed his missiles at populism was Columbia University in New York, an institution that he liked to idealize in the noblest terms. He had been shocked and deeply antagonized by the student protests there in April 1968, and when he spoke at Columbia's graduation ceremony that year, many of the students in the audience stood up and walked out on him. 2 years later, Hofstadter paid them back in kind. In an interview with Newsweek magazine published a few months before his untimely death in 1970, he referred to the 60s as the age of rubbish, and criticized left-wing college students for an elitism that was based on moral indignation against most of the rest of us. When he referred to the vast numbers of Americans who intensely dislike young people, college students mainly, Hofstadter was describing what he saw in society, but as he talked on it was clear that he was referring to himself. He resented students for their precious radicalism and for their moral indignation against the society that had raised them, and he cast this resentment in stark, class-based terms. The activist young operate from elitist premises which they themselves aren't aware of, but which working people are acutely aware of. The kids ask for 2 weeks off for conducting political activities, or to go on a pass-fail basis at the end of the term because so few of them have completed their work. People who work in offices and on assembly lines can't negotiate such arrangements, but if they could, they'd certainly have to sacrifice their salaries. The kids implicitly assume a certain kind of indulgence that other types of people in this society don't get. This is intensely resented. The kids dislike the idea that they're thinking and acting as an elite, but they are. 33. As the larger world came to embrace Hofstadter's suspicion of mass movements, Hofstadter himself became a populist, of exactly the embittered kind he had spent his career analyzing. 7. The money changers burned the temple. In the early 70s, a fog of grievance settled over the land. Never have Americans hated authorities like they did after the Vietnam War turned sour, after Watergate taught us the incorrigible venality of our elected leaders. Big government seemed omnipotent and yet incompetent. It possessed the world's greatest military machine, but it couldn't do anything right. In the long list of groups it aimed to serve, we the people always seemed to come last. This snarling mood of disillusionment was the characteristic sensibility of the decade. The wellsprings of trust had been poisoned, two self-designated populist authors wrote back in 1972. One, they are still poisoned today. The whole country was mad as hell, to use a favorite catchphrase, and the discontent seemed to go in every direction at once. It was economic, it was political, it was racial, it was cultural, it was liberal, it was conservative. Americans despised the CIA and also the Soviet Union. We cheered for Clint Eastwood as a rule-breaking cop who blasted lowlifes even when the lawyers told him to stop. And then we cheered for Burt Reynolds as a bandit in a black Trans Am, the roads behind him littered with the smoking remains of the Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia highway patrols. Responding to the new sensibility, our politicians tried to impress us with their humility. They courted us with soft southern accents, with tales of peanut farms and pork rinds. They posed as defenders of the people, the forgotten man, the silent majority, the great overtaxed middle, the normal Americans suffering the contempt of shadowy TV network elites. To list the leaders who were identified by the press in the 1970s as populists would be to include virtually the entire roster of prominent statesmen. Both Richard Nixon and his opponent, George McGovern, were tagged with the P word. So were Jimmy Carter, Ted Kennedy, and the hawkish Democratic Senator Henry Jackson. So were big city mayors Frank Rizzo and John Lindsay. So was West Virginia politician Jay Rockefeller, a great-grandson of the biggest populist devil figure of them all. 2. Jim Hightower, the legendary Texas activist, relates the following tale from the 70s populism craze. One day a friend of his who worked for the Congressional Research Service received a request from the office of Senator Lloyd Bentsen, a man Hightower describes as an aloof and patrician Texas Democrat who was known on Capitol Hill primarily as a faithful emissary for Wall Street interests. Bentsen was thinking of a presidential run, Hightower continues, and evidently he wanted a big idea with which to distinguish himself. And so, what is a populist? Read the query. The senator thinks he might be one. 3. And why not? Everyone else said they were one, and the pseudo-populist rebellions they led ultimately turned out to be great for Wall Street interests. What those years of revolt made possible was the opposite of populism: tax cuts, deregulation, deindustrialization, and the disempowerment of working-class people through the destruction of their unions. By which I mean, the populist rhetoric invoked so abundantly in those years provided a perfect cover for the elitist politics we actually embraced. In the period I am describing, trade unions went from being a normal part of everyday life to a thing that had to be rooted out and crushed. America attacked inflation by embracing austerity. We gave up on the dream of economic equality, gave up on it so utterly that, in years to come, we would find it difficult even to recall what Luther and Roosevelt meant when they used those words. It needn't have happened that way. It was true that the old liberal order was having problems by the early 1970s, but the bonfire of public anger that consumed the country might have brought renewal to that system just as easily as right-wing backlash against it. Yes, Democratic leaders chose to turn away from the white working class and, yes, Republicans reached out successfully to that same group, but what that represented was not inevitability. It was liberal folly. Bayard Rustin wrote one of the most perceptive takes on this situation back in 1971. So perceptive that it might have been written in 1980, or 2000, or yesterday. The potential for a Republican majority depends upon Nixon's success in attracting into the conservative fold lower middle-class whites, the same group that the liberal, new politics has written off. The question is not whether this group is conservative or liberal, for it is both, and how it acts will depend upon the way the issues are defined. If they are defined as race and descent, then Nixon will win. But if, on the other hand, they are defined so as to appeal to the progressive economic interests of the lower middle class, then it becomes possible to build an alliance on the basis of common interest between this group and the black community. 4. Might the white working class have joined a transracial movement taking America in a progressive direction rather than on into the decades of Reagan, Bush, and Trump? Unlikely though it sounds today, it was definitely possible. After all, while some were angry with the liberal establishment because it was supposedly soft on crime and committed to racial integration, others were angry because it wasn't really liberal at all, because it had dumped the entire burden of the Vietnam War on their children, because it seemed only to care about the well-educated, because it was happily handing out subsidies to favorite corporate behemoths while their blue-collar lives still sucked. Between these two alternative viewpoints lay the political choices of the decades to come. Would Americans choose some grand appeal to social solidarity, as they had in the past? Would we try tepid, managerial centrism? Or would we plunge headlong into the glamorous, self-pitying resentment of the culture wars? The irony is that all three of these alternatives would be described with the same word: populism. Let me repeat that a renewed populism of the left was possible. Although almost nobody remembers it anymore, the early 1970s saw the biggest strike wave since World War II, with some 2.4 million workers walking out. Most of these were by the book work stoppages called by the leadership of still mighty national unions, but a surprising number of them were wildcat actions that were authorized by nobody except ordinary workers themselves. On top of this came a series of grassroots efforts to replace the labor movement's aging and conservative and sometimes corrupt leadership, rank-and-file insurgencies in the steelworkers, the mineworkers, and the Teamsters, which were joined by a group of black union leaders drawn from across the movement. This new breed was nothing like Archie Bunker or the hard hat stereotype of those days. They were strong believers in workplace democracy. They were overwhelmingly anti-racist and anti-war. They were often non-white and non-male. 5. Among the artifacts of this brief period of blue-collar possibility is a forgotten little book from 1972 called A Populist Manifesto, which proposed a grand plan for the 70s generation. A pact between the have-nots. The manifesto's authors zeroed right in on the essential populist idea. The key to building any new majority in American politics is a coalition of self-interest between blacks and low and moderate-income whites, they declared. That was because the real division in this country is not between generations or between races, but between the rich who have power and those blacks and whites who have neither power nor property. This was not a description of an existing movement, however, it was a blueprint for a new populism that might be called into being, a platform for a movement that does not yet exist. 6. There was a populist revival in academia to go along with this renewed spirit of working-class revolt. It focused, appropriately enough, on the People's Party of the 1890s, instead of a cautionary tale about the paranoia and bigotry of working-class movements. The story of populism was now remembered as a kind of golden moment for freedom itself. This was the teaching of Democratic Promise, Lawrence Goodwin's landmark 1976 history. The book aimed to do nothing less than turn history's conventional understanding of progress upside down. The Pops, Goodwin insisted, had a sense of democratic engagement that was better developed than our own. Their movement, he wrote, made the fragile hopes of participants in our own 20th century American society seem cramped by comparison. 7. One working politician who tried to build the populist ideas of the era into something larger was the Oklahoma Senator Fred Harris, who ran for president as a Democrat in 1976. Harris spent the 60s as a reliable supporter of Great Society programs, but in the 70s he looked out over a country where the traditional alliances of liberalism were crumbling. Where the Okies he grew up among were voting for George Wallace and where the right was on the ascendant. Liberal appeals were no longer convincing to anyone, and Harris went looking for the reason why. The answer was that liberalism had developed a massive contradiction. As Harris wrote in 1973, you can't appeal to black people and poor people on the basis of their own self-interest, and to everybody else, meaning the vast, undifferentiated middle class, on the basis of morality. That kind of an appeal is the luxury of the intellectual elite, for people who are, themselves, socially and economically secure. 8. How to resolve this? The answer, Harris wrote, was to appeal to just about everyone except the wealthy on the basis of self-interest, by taking on concentrated wealth and corporate power. By declaring war against oil companies, big banks, agribusiness, and so on. Harris proposed to build a transracial alliance of all non-rich people, white as well as black. His new populism, he wrote, seeks to put America back together again, across the lines of race, age, sex, and region. Those in the coalition don't have to love each other. I wish they would, but all they have to do is recognize their common interests. 9. The issue is privilege, was the remarkable slogan under which Harris ran for the presidency in 1976. He promised to break up General Motors, Big Oil, and other gigantic agglomerations of economic power. He routinely quoted Jesse Jackson, which was then regarded as a daring move for an ambitious politician. 10. The innovation for which Harris will always be remembered, however, was his spectacular low-budget campaign, driving around the country in a camper, using his house as his headquarters, staying in the homes of supporters, carrying his own bags, making his calls on a payphone at the local gas station. This campaign will be a people's campaign, both in strategy and belief, Harris said on launching the effort. These populist strategies were meant to illustrate the populist beliefs, of course, but Harris also thought of his regular guy run for the White House as a necessity. The only way someone with his views could possibly stand for high office was by doing it on a shoestring. 11. The common thread among these populist revivalists was that all of them had some experience with civil rights and had thus learned the power of mass movements. Jack Newfield, a journalist who co-authored a populist manifesto, had been in the audience for Martin Luther King's Montgomery speech in 1965. While Lawrence Goodwin had spent much of the 60s organizing working-class black and brown voters in Texas. 12. Fred Harris, for his part, called for and then served on the Kerner Commission, which investigated the causes of the urban riots of 1967. 50 years later, as the commission's last surviving member, Harris often commented on its legacy. See, for example, the op-ed that he co-authored for the New York Times, The Unmet Promise of Equality, February 28, 2018. Another thing all of them did was reject the technocratic, elitist liberalism that was then emerging. The Democratic Party was making its fateful turn away from organized labor in those days. They were becoming a party of experts and technocrats, of white-collar professionals who admired fancy college degrees but had little interest in working-class solidarity. Elitist was the word a populist manifesto used to describe emerging centrist liberalism, a stylish politics for people bedazzled by experts but contemptuous toward their blue-collar countrymen. Populism, as the authors imagined it, mistrusts the technocrats from the Rand Corporation and the Harvard Business School. Lawrence Goodwin, for his part, called rule by experts a Leninist paradigm that justifies itself by expressing its impatience with mass human performance. 13. People are smart enough to govern themselves, is how Fred Harris put this fundamental article of faith. Also, experts are always wrong. Where they were most wrong, he continued, was on foreign policy questions, which had for decades been directed by elites from business and academia, and which Harris proposed to democratize. You have to open that thing up, level with people, let them in on things. Harris said these words in 1975, by which time the disasters of Vietnam were familiar to all. He added, when you do, you can no longer justify most of what's going on. 14. In the large field of Democrats running for the presidency in 1976, several other candidates imitated Harris' trademark humility while divorcing it completely from his call for a war on privilege. Populism as style became a runaway #1 smash hit. Populism as multiracial economic democracy faded slowly into the sunset. Here was the catchphrase that eventually captured the nation's heart that year. My name is Jimmy Carter, and I'm running for president. With such humble and direct words did the jeans-wearing, anti-politician, from Georgia make himself the screen upon which Democrats projected their populist dreams, populism, now meaning a sunny, upbeat people-ism. 15. Hailing from far outside Washington power circles and taking on a platoon of more famous Democrats, Jimmy Carter proceeded to win the party's presidential nomination in a blurry but noble-sounding quest to restore people's faith in a political system that looked rotten and corrupted after Watergate and Vietnam. Carter was certainly capable of speaking the old populist language. In his acceptance speech at the Democratic convention that summer, he denounced, in his soft-spoken way, the political economic elite, who never had to account for mistakes, regardless of how they screwed up. Lobbyists, the CIA, the income tax system, all of them were offensive to the democratic spirit as Carter understood it. It is time for the people to run the government, he announced, and not the other way around. When Carter used the word populist, however, he meant to invoke comforting myths of the general will, not working-class solidarity. On the campaign trail, Carter encouraged journalists to use the term to describe him as a way of avoiding the conventional tags, liberal and conservative. What populism was all about, he said, was expressing the will of the people, embracing a politics that arose directly from the concerns and the yearnings of the people themselves, which is my own definition of populism. 16. There were other definitions floating around out there, but somehow, Carter always managed to fit. In 1976, the liberal New York Times columnist Anthony Lewis watched Carter give an idealistic speech about how fine the American people were and decided right then and there that the man was a democratic hero. I thought, Jimmy Carter really does see himself fighting entrenched power, the status quo. He resents privilege, official arrogance, unfairness. He thinks of himself as one of the outsiders, those without power in society. In short, he is an authentic modern voice of that old American strain, populism. 17. Journalistic admiration of Carter's ordinariness hit a sort of crescendo with his inauguration in January 1977, when the new president showed his distaste for the trappings of power by walking the length of Pennsylvania Avenue instead of riding in his limousine. Carter's speech, according to one wire service account, struck a populist tone by calling for humility, mercy, and justice. This is a definition worth remembering in a time when our public thinkers routinely describe populism as a philosophy of vanity, cruelty, and intolerance, plus a snickering disregard for the rights of others. 18. Put Carter's humility aside and examine his actual deeds in the White House, however, and it becomes clear that his was the least populist administration since Herbert Hoover's. The historian Jefferson Cowie calls the Carter years the New Deal that never happened, and the phrase is apt. After years of working-class discontent and African-American uprisings, Carter's victory was the great opportunity for Democrats to show what they could do for the vast majority of the population. Instead, they did next to nothing. Oh, they were able to get a big capital gains tax cut passed, all right, and if you're looking for the roots of today's extreme inequality, it's a good place to start. Carter's Democrats deregulated airlines and trucking. They embraced austerity as inflation mounted higher and higher. They stood by indifferently as an employer counterattack squashed the decade's militant unionism. When it came to New Deal programs like a proposed full employment scheme, they proved to be worse than useless. 19. What the Carter team really cared about was fighting inflation and balancing the budget, anti-populist causes for which they were willing to accept spiraling unemployment. When his hand-picked Fed chairman, Paul Volcker, chose to tackle inflation by jacking interest rates up to a now unthinkable 20%, he sent the economy into a sharp recession that, in turn, scorched Carter's hopes for a second term. As for the ordinary Americans who were hard hit by the shutting down of prosperity, Volcker had this winning admonition: the standard of living of the average American has to decline. A bland technocrat straight out of the consensus playbook, Jimmy Carter represented a new kind of Democrat, a post-New Deal centrist who campaigned with vague populist niceness but whose true affection was reserved for ultra-competent policy experts. This understanding of liberal leadership would far outlast Carter's political career. We would see it again in the presidencies of Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, two more true believers in meritocracy who also thought to present themselves as kindly reformers on the side of ordinary people. In 1980, Carter led his Democrats into a sickening disaster. In a landslide, the country chose a new kind of Republican, Ronald Reagan, a man of ideology and moralistic rhetoric who also campaigned as a populist but who offered a far more forceful solution to the cynicism of the age. All through the 1970s, the right had been sharpening its own populist appeal, coming up with all sorts of ways to express its outraged hostility to affectation and privilege, none of which, mirabile dictu, ever got in the way of their equally unrelenting efforts to roll back liberal economic achievements. You know what I'm talking about, reader. The right's war on the establishment has been the inescapable political soundtrack of the last 40 years, playing at high volume from loudspeakers all around you. It has powered countless political careers. Thousands of fire-breathing right-wing bestsellers have been printed so that they might clutter the attics of middle America. Conservative warriors too numerous to list have risen to celebrity status, radio, TV, journalism, burned briefly with rage against the establishment, and then settled back into obscurity. What establishment, precisely, did this populist uprising aim to confront? Well, there was the media, who supposedly poison our news and distort the truth. The intellectuals who hate our country, who instruct our kids in hating our country, who capitulate immediately to any kind of radical who hates our country. The pampered college kids who insult our soldiers and our cops. The activist judges who make the law rather than interpret it. In other words, the elite, the disdainful, contemptuous, East Coast, liberated, raised consciousness elite. Elites who longed to give away the Panama Canal. Elites who were soft on welfare, soft on crime, soft on school discipline, soft on communism. But who still wanted to make Americans wear seatbelts and drive cars with airbags. Elites who failed to live up to basic moral standards of behavior when in the Oval Office. Elites who make endless excuses for Muslim terrorism. What I am trying to describe with this hyperbole is a kind of inverted class war. A conflict that, as an early backlasher put it, finds the upper classes rhetorically on the side of revolution in values and structure, and the lower classes rhetorically on the side of stability, slower evolution, and loyalty. 20. But the war was also about race. Almost wherever you looked, the young Republican strategist Kevin Phillips wrote in a once famous book, white voters were moving away from the Democratic Party because it had come to be identified with African American protest and achievement. The principal force which broke up the Democratic New Deal coalition, Phillips wrote, is the Negro socio-economic revolution and liberal Democratic ideological inability to cope with it. 21, whatever that meant. In Phillips's understanding of the age, ideas counted for little. Demographics was all, and tribalism was the essential political impulse. In one supremely cynical passage, Phillips even seemed to encourage the Republicans to continue vigorous civil rights enforcement, despite the preferences of the party's new, racist voters because securing African American voting rights would accelerate the ugly phenomenon of racial sorting. The more blacks entered the political process, Phillips predicted, the more they would seize control of the Southern Democratic Party, and the more the region's whites would come running to the GOP. 22. The word that Phillips chose to describe what was going on with this new, majoritarian Republican Party was populism. Those who hated or opposed the country's establishment, or privileged elite, were populists, and the great shift underway was the transition of the Republican Party from one of these poles to the other, from establishmentarianism to populism. As we know, biracial coordination was one of the things that defined 1890s populism, but for Phillips, the new populist coalition includes very few Negroes. This form of populism encouraged one group of working people to despise another. 23, oddly enough, Phillips seemed to be aware of this. In the course of his famous book, The Emerging Republican Majority, Phillips used populist, both in the original sense, describing the destruction of the biracial People's Party at the hands of the Southern elite, and also in the completely opposite sense, as a shorthand for racist Southern demagogues, which is to say, the people who destroyed it. The great opportunity for this phony populism of the right, in both its cultural and its racist flavors, arrived in the late 70s. Its embodiment was an actor, of course, Sonny Ronald Reagan, who played the heroic Rooseveltian role, the man who would dispel the air of defeat and decline that hovered over the United States. Reagan would save us from the great malaise of the Carter presidency. He would inspire us with talk about our rendezvous with destiny. He would lead us on a great national crusade to make America great again. That last phrase was one Reagan used in his 1980 acceptance speech to the Republican convention, and his theme that night, as with so many of FDR's speeches, was the problem of out-of-control elites sneering at the common man. It wasn't money changers in the temple that Reagan aimed to disperse, however, it was the temple itself that needed to be burned down. Reagan promised the assembled Republicans that he would do it in the name of the working men and women, for whom the bureaucrats' pet programs were merely a theft from their pocketbooks. So perverse had the situation become, Reagan continued, that the government now heeded the advice of a tiny minority opposed to economic growth, rather than the voices of the great majority. It was actively betraying the trust and goodwill of the American workers who keep it going with their taxes. But his administration would put things right, Reagan declared. It would put an end to the notion that the American taxpayer exists to fund the federal government. The federal government exists to serve the American people. At Reagan's feet, the old-school Republicans celebrated their triumph. Realtors and small-town bankers, insurance brokers and Buick dealers, pensioners and golfers for life. Dressed in the colorful blazers and whimsical hats of convention-goers circa 1980, they capered joyfully about the arena, screaming their approval. Now it was their turn to play rebel. "We can build a new majority around social and economic populism," the conservative Republican Congressman Jack Kemp announced that same year. What he meant by that expression was simple: tax cuts, like the far-reaching one that President Reagan would sign into law the following year. 24. Mad as hell businessmen were now the ultimate populist subject. Not farm women, or sharecroppers, or day laborers. Business people. They were zealots for reform wherever you turned. The burning idea behind their uprising was that to oppose capitalism or to scoff at the successful were acts of snobbery, if not of outright bigotry. No one put it better than social theorist George Gilder, whose 1981 book Wealth and Poverty was widely hailed as the handbook of Reaganism. The war against the rich, Gilder wrote, is a campaign now led and inspired by the declining rich, to arouse the currently poor against the insurgently successful business classes. In a verbatim reversal of the old populist formula, he announced that hatred of producers of wealth, meaning capitalists, was the racism of the intelligentsia. 25. Reagan brought all the seething resentments of right-wing populism together. His advisor Jeffrey Bell tried to describe the coherence of Reagan's populist agenda for readers of the Wall Street Journal in 1981. The genial movie star, Bell wrote, was going on the offensive against elites and elitism in every policy area. Reagan was cracking down on judicial activism, the epitome of elitist government. He was cutting taxes, to the chagrin of the economics profession. He was slashing federal spending, thus fighting an unelected Washington bureaucracy, wielding unprecedented power, and he might even return the country to the gold standard, which puts him on the populist side, Bell absurdly declared, because going back on gold would strip power from central bankers and economists. 26. How did Ronald Reagan, the Hollywood dandy, come to hold such emancipatory views? Bell explained that the transformation had come about in a radically populist way. During the 1950s, Reagan had been a spokesman for General Electric, hosting the giant corporation's weekly TV show and touring its factories to talk with its workers. It seems these visits to GE installations had been like a graduate seminar in the School of Hard Knocks. As Reagan met with workers on the shop floor, the suntanned Californian was forced to listen to their real-world grievances. Absorbing these long drafts of honest proletarian wisdom, according to Bell, he was eventually converted to his populist suspicion of government. 27. Let me pause here to remind you of something everyone knows. The revolution Reagan would inaugurate as president would shift the wealth of the world upward in a history-altering way. It would smash the power of organized labor once and for all. It would deregulate the banks and crush the dreams of ordinary Americans in towns and cities across the country. But in the beginning, the myth of Reagan as a man of the people seems somehow plausible. When campaigning in 1980, the candidate deliberately avoided identifying with big business, preferring, as he put it, all those people I shake hands with who have calluses on their hands. 28. The pseudopopulist revolution of the early 1980s didn't spend a lot of time pondering the nature of democracy or weighing its place in the Jeffersonian tradition. This populism was about winning elections and then rewriting the tax code, not theorizing. This uprising had no Omaha platform, no Lawrence Goodwin, no Bayard Rustin. To the extent that the right-wing revolt had a philosophy at all, it was that government was the real elite, with its outrageous taxes and its wasteful spending. Federal intervention of virtually any kind was elitist by definition because it removed power from individuals and handed it over to government workers in Washington, D.C. Therefore, farm programs, so beloved of the original populists, were elitist. So were public works. So was basically any effort to achieve economic equality. All of it was snobbery. As the conservative direct mail guru Richard Viguerie put it in his contribution to the genre, the elitists in Washington believe that a fair distribution of the nation's wealth can be brought about only if it is controlled by the government, that is, by the elitists in Washington. 29. 2 terms of the Reagan presidency curdled this upside-down populism into a grotesque self-parody. But on it went. In 1988, George H. W. Bush, a prince of the establishment blood and quite possibly the preppiest man in America managed to get himself elected president by making what his campaign manager, Lee Atwater, called an emotional, populist appeal to traditional values. By which Atwater meant chomping on pork rinds, visiting flag factories, frolicking about the Midwest with country singers, and promising to get tough with criminals, meaning African Americans. 30. For observers of populism as fraud, 1988 was a year of wonders, a zenith of fakery. Not only had populism become an almost exclusively right-wing phenomenon, but everyone who followed politics understood it to be a Putin. Even a born member of the nation's aristocracy could pull it off, given a sufficiently oblivious opponent. The Democrats supplied that opponent, Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis, a budget-balancing technocrat who took care to distance himself from his party's egalitarian traditions. It was all about competence. Dukakis said, not ideology. Not surprisingly, the public chose flag factory jingoism over tepid, complacent centrism. The disgust I felt that election day made me physically ill, and so I hope you will excuse me if I skip over all the preposterous variations on the populist theme worked into years since then by such flag-waving champions of the working man as Oliver North, Newt Gingrich, Rush Limbaugh, Bill O'Reilly, Glenn Beck, Sarah Palin, or by George Bush's son Dubia, or by the NRA, or by Fox News, or by Rick Santelli and the Tea Party movement. I am sick of them all. Still, let us genuflect before the superhuman perversity of the thing. Tax cuts, union busting, and deregulation, the historic achievements of right-wing populism, have led us straight back to the massively skewed economic arrangements of the 1890s. It takes a kind of hallucinatory bravado to call yourself a populist while cracking down on workers and ignoring antitrust laws, which the Reagan administration and its successors did. It's like a banker calling himself a freedom fighter because he likes Basque cuisine. It's like a slumlord signing his eviction notices, yours in solidarity. The career of one particular right-wing warrior holds special significance for our story. Patrick J. Buchanan, who has worked variously as a newspaper columnist, a speechwriter for Richard Nixon, communications director for Ronald Reagan, a TV pundit, and who also ran 3 insurgent campaigns for the presidency. Along the way, he did as much as anyone to reorient our understanding of populism. It was Buchanan who coined Nixon's famous phrase, silent majority, and who urged him to cast himself as the embodiment of a middle American uprising against elites. It was Buchanan who roared, in a speech at the 1992 Republican Convention, that the libs had launched a cultural war against ordinary Americans. Buchanan enthusiastically embraced the term populist during his presidential campaigns, seeming to understand that it ennobled his neo-medieval views. To this day on his website he can be seen posing with a pitchfork to emphasize his kinship with the angry agrarians of old. Strictly speaking, however, his claim to the title is weak. Buchanan is a lifelong Washingtonian whose ugly insinuations about Jews and Nazis and the Holocaust are well known. Getting more people to vote, he has even claimed, is the diabolical method by which liberals are going to dispossess good, reputable citizens. 31. Bigotry and suspiciousness are not unusual on the far right, of course. What distinguished Pat Buchanan from his fellow Republicans was the startling innovation he brought to their primary contests, ripping corporate America and his own party for betraying working-class people with international trade agreements. Among conservatives this sneak attack was considered shocking, since it came from a man who virtually worshipped Ronald Reagan, destroyer of working-class organizations and the ultimate author of those trade agreements. Still, it made for good theater, and in the course of his offensives against his old friends, Buchanan could sometimes sound like a 1930s labor leader, blasting GOP warhorse Bob Dole as the bellhop of the Business Roundtable, and standing outside a shuttered factory to speak on behalf of the losers from these trade deals. 3-2, asterisk among other things. Buchanan's victory in the New Hampshire primary in 1996 triggered a remarkable anti-populist outburst from conservative intellectual Bill Kristol. Republicans, Kristol griped, had shown almost too much concern and attention for, quote, the people, that is, the people's will, their prejudices and their foolish opinions. And in a certain sense, we're all paying the price for that now. After all, we conservatives are on the side of the lords and barons, quoted in Lloyd Grove, The Castle Storms Back, Washington Post, February 23, 1996, p. C1. Populism was all an act with this Beltway bozo, a Boston newspaper columnist fumed, but nevertheless Buchanan succeeded in making the act seem noticeably more authentic. 33 Every Republican was denouncing elites back then, but Buchanan had gone from attacking the cultural elite for hating the flag to attacking the corporate elite as well. He did it, even more significantly, just as the traditional Party of Labor was recasting itself as trade-friendly New Democrats. In the run-up to the 2000 elections, a New York real estate developer with appalling taste but high political ambitions, Donald Trump, vied against Buchanan for the top spot on a third-party ticket. In the course of this contest, Trump called Buchanan a neo-Nazi and a Hitler lover, deplored the way he picked on Jews, and wrote an op-ed for the Los Angeles Times depicting Buchanan as a busy little bigot who had a put down for just about everyone. On slow days, he attacks gays, immigrants, welfare recipients, even Zulus. 34. But by the time of his own presidential run in 2016, Trump had pretty much taken over Buchanan's old program, from the ecumenical bigotry right down to his 1992 campaign slogan, America First. Trump had always been critical of America's trade practices, and now he seemed to understand that the real audience for such a critique was not his fellow business leaders but American workers, abandoned by the increasingly upper-class Democratic Party. 35. Buchanan, for his part, chortled with delight to behold the Trump phenomenon, which he described as the future. Trump had hard proof these trade deals have deindustrialized America, Buchanan told the Washington Post. From 2000 to 2010, the U.S. lost 55,000 factories and 6 million manufacturing jobs. When the Post asked him how Trump should proceed with his presidential campaign, Buchanan came back with a reply that should have rung every alarm bell in Washington. After securing the party base, go for victory in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan and Wisconsin, by campaigning against the Clinton trade policies, and on a new Trump trade agenda to reindustrialize America. 36. Those remarks were published in January 2016, a year before Trump would be sworn in as president after taking exactly those 4 states. Buchanan provided the model, but it took a political entrepreneur named Steve Bannon to mold Donald Trump's loudmouth opportunism into the full-blown thing the world has come to know as populism. Class was central to the insurgency Bannon believed he summoned up as Trump's chief campaign executive. Although Bannon once worked as an executive at Goldman Sachs, he is the product of what one profile called a blue-collar, union and democratic family, and was said to feel an unreconstructed sense of class awareness, or bitterness, or betrayal. Betrayal, specifically, by the 2 main political parties, which promised such fine things to the working man, and yet always chose the elite when the going got tough. 37. Betrayal, more specifically, by Wall Street. It seems that Bannon's dad, a salt of the earth type, got badly played during the 2008 financial crisis, persuaded to panic by a financial huckster on TV and to sell, at almost the exact bottom, of course, his little hoard of shares in AT&T, the company where he spent his working life. The only net worth my father had beside his tiny little house was that AT&T stock. Bannon seized shortly after the 2016 election, and nobody is held accountable? All these firms get bailed out. There's no equity taken from anybody. There's no one in jail. These companies are all over-leveraged, and everyone looked the other way. 38. As Buchanan had done with trade deals, so Bannon did with the bank bailouts. He swiped the outrage that should have belonged to the left. Democratic officeholders never really contested his grab for it, of course. Their energy was all going into claiming that everything was okay, that the problem had been solved, that there was no reason for the economic grievances expressed by people like Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders. So the right stepped in, claiming leadership of this generation's revolt against the financial establishment. For Steve Bannon, the financial crisis and the bailouts were the inciting incident for the global populist rebellion he wanted to lead. The movement in the United States, and the one that I am associated with worldwide, is anti-elite. We believe that what I call the party of Davos, this kind of scientific, engineering, managerial, financial, cultural elite, has taken the world in the wrong direction, buying into globalization to the detriment of the little guy. And so this is really a representation of anti-elitism, and really about having the little guy get a piece of the action. 39. Republicans had been performing indignation against a shadowy, liberal elite for decades, but now Bannon came close to identifying society's true dominant class. In the process, he swiped some of the classic formulations of the American left. We have socialism in the United States for the very wealthy and the very poor, and a brutal form of Darwinian capitalism for everybody else, Bannon said on one occasion. 40. He has spoken often of his dream of turning the GOP, that mighty fortress of bankers and billionaires, of fat cats and war hawks, into a workers' party, which is what the original populists tried to build in 1892, in his brief career in the West Wing. Bannon reportedly fantasized about inflicting an old-fashioned 44% marginal tax rate on high-earning individuals. Bannon expressed this idea to Robert Kuttner in an amazing interview published in the left-wing magazine The American Prospect on October 6, 2017. Bannon said it again to The Guardian in an interview published on December 17, 2019. Donald Trump himself has said almost exactly the same thing. See the story by Josh Green, How to Get Trump Elected When He's Wrecking Everything. You Built, Bloomberg Businessweek, May 26, 2016. On the campaign trail, Donald Trump was playing a similar game. On the issue of trade, for example, he took an unusual stance for a Republican. Constantly criticizing NAFTA and trade with China, the bête noires of organized labor, and reaching out to alienated, white, working-class voters, the rank and file of so many historical protest movements. He said he cared so very much about the people of the deindustrialized zones and their sufferings. He claimed to feel for the victims of the opioid epidemic. The billionaire did his best to sound like a protest candidate, angry to see ordinary Americans abused by the mighty. In his final TV commercial of the 2016 race, he tapped the zillion-volt themes of perfidious financial elites and the nobility of the common man. He denounced what he called the establishment as follows. It's a global power structure that is responsible for the economic decisions that have robbed our working class, stripped our country of its wealth, and put that money into the pockets of a handful of large corporations and political entities. The only thing that can stop this corrupt machine is you. The only force strong enough to save our country is us. The only people brave enough to vote out this corrupt establishment is you, the American people. Let us pause here and acknowledge how strange this is. A conservative was assailing the global power structure. A Republican was claiming deindustrialization as one of the great causes of the right. And he was doing so in language that bordered on the idealistic. With a few changes, Trump's monologue might have been uttered by a Democrat of the old school, which was certainly his campaign's intention. 41. The most forthright statement of Trumpian populism, if that's the name for it, was his inaugural address, which Trump took as another occasion to denounce the establishment, in characteristically Bannon-esque tones. An assemblage of one-line clichés, it saw the billionaire declaring that his rise to the presidency represented no mere trade-off between parties but rather a transfer of power, from Washington, D.C., to you, the American people. He also declared, in a shout-out to the 1930s, that the forgotten men and women of our country will be forgotten no longer, and described the landscape of deindustrialization as rusted-out factories scattered like tombstones across the landscape of our nation. And then, the working-class hero in the Oval Office delivered a landmark tax cut for the rich. Trump deregulated Wall Street banks, too. With his attacks on Obamacare, the president did his part to make our capitalist system just a little more brutal and Darwinian for ordinary people. He turned over the judiciary to the elites of the Federalist Society. He turned over the economy to the Chamber of Commerce. He turned the EPA over to polluters. He ran the U.S. government in a way designed to enrich and empower himself. The one leadership task to which Trump took with enthusiasm, rolling back the regulatory state, is essentially an attack on one of the few institutions in Washington designed to help working-class Americans. If this is populism, the word has truly come to mean nothing. It is a commonplace of Trump theory to depict the 45th president as utterly without precedent, a man whose every word is a falsehood and whose every move is a constitutional crisis. But as these gross betrayals of his base remind us, Trump is far more a culmination of long-term right-wing trends than he is a divergence from them. The ridiculous nickname his supporters applied to him in 2016, the blue-collar billionaire, summarized perfectly the Reagan-era idea that tycoons are regular guys just like workers. Trump's war on the media is just an old melody from the Nixon era that he has chosen to play in a pounding fortissimo. Trump's broad, careless bigotry is just a slightly more open expression of the prejudice that has tickled the right-wing mind ever since George Wallace. Trump's fascination with tariffs, he is a tariff man, he announced in 2018, is merely a return to the habits of William McKinley, who was known as the Napoleon of protection. Nor is Steve Bannon's populism much more genuine. Listen to this brassy, assertive man talk for more than a few minutes and you start to realize that there's nothing beneath the surface froth. The whole right-wing populist revolt of 2016, you start to suspect, was little more than a clever conservative outreach program, an effort to gin up the fury of the disinherited without actually doing anything for them. Winning was not even necessarily Trump's goal. He and his Republicans prevailed by accident, and by the most unpopulist of means, by the Electoral College. By gerrymandering, by vote suppressing. And, once again, by the dazzling folly of the other side. In 2016, Trump defeated a better-funded and far more competent opponent, a Democrat who was advised by the best consultants in the business and behind whom the nation's financial and cultural and media elites stood united. But in their revulsion against Trump's ugly rhetoric, the Democrats committed an elementary mistake, dismissing the anti-elitist impulse itself because the man who was thought to embody it was so manifestly a blowhard. What they failed to understand is what centrist Democrats have persistently failed to understand since the 1970s. Technocratic competence isn't enough, especially when that competence somehow never means improving the lives of working people. Just because the imbecile Trump denounced elites doesn't mean those elites are a legitimate ruling class. Just because the hypocrite Trump pretended to care about deindustrialization doesn't mean deindustrialization is of no concern. Just because the brute Trump mimicked the language of proletarian discontent doesn't mean working people are deplorables. 8. Let us now scold uncouth men. The long debate over populism that I have traced in this book has been, in part, a debate over image and rhetoric. But it has also been about something more solid, How liberals are to understand their relationship to the country they want to reform and the people they wish to lead. One liberal model, the elite paradigm, admires expertise and looks to highly educated professionals to make the right decisions on our behalf. The other, the populist model, looks to ordinary people as the ultimate repository of the democratic genius. For many years, the Democratic Party followed the populist model. That's what many of its leaders thought democracy was all about. But beginning in the 1970s, liberalism began to change. Over the course of countless intra-party debates, the Democrats came to think of themselves not as the voice of working-class people at all but as a sort of coming together of the learned and the virtuous. They came to this understanding, ironically, at the historical moment when populism, as a generalized hostility to the establishment, was sweeping the country. From Madison Avenue to the classic rock radio station in your sad hometown, Americans were imagining themselves to be rebels against rules and tradition and authority. Even conservatives were posturing as insurgents. The only group that seemed to have trouble embracing this new mood was the Democratic Party. And so we come at last to the shabby synthesis to which this book's many competing strands have been leading us all along. As conservatives trumpeted their uprising, liberals turned against it all. They became anti-populists. The dominant faction of the Democratic Party decided they wanted no part of any systematic criticism of big business or monopoly or the financial industry. They shied away from building or supporting mass movements. The idea of putting together a coalition of working-class people was one they came to regard with deep distaste. Scorning ideology and passion, insisting that our problems were technical in nature, this was the shorthand version of what became the democratic philosophy. The answer to the class-based onslaught of the right, Democrats began to believe, was to surrender their own claims to the populist tradition and to get past ideology altogether. When compared to the party's record in the New Deal era, this was not a particularly successful electoral strategy. Until very recently, however, none of the party's setbacks over the years caused their thought leaders to reconsider the decision to become the party of the white-collar elite. Instead, they used what power they had to encourage investment banking and to secure trade agreements that were designed not to grow but to hollow out American industry. When challenged by constituents who found themselves on the receiving end of such policies, Democrats would roll out economists and political scientists to inform working people that what had happened to them was the consequence of inevitability, of economic progress itself. Populism became a term of anathema for the party's thinkers. In a celebrated book from 1992, the fledgling pundit Mickey Cause advised Democrats to abandon their traditional concern for economic equality and to resist the people he called money liberal populists. Dems had to stop listening to labor unions, he said, and visibly sever their ties with the black underclass. Similar denunciations were a common thread in the publications of the Democratic Leadership Council, where you could see populists defined as those who resist the changes stemming from a new economy, and who longed pointlessly for the glory days when Americans had stable jobs at big corporations. 1. The big corporations line was an interesting twist, but the essence of the argument was the same as ever. Once again, populists were defined as people who foolishly refused the future, crying about their beloved toilers when everyone could see that the only ones that mattered were white-collar professionals, the learning class, to use the name co-invented for them by political scientist William Galston. What the innovative dynamism of the learning class represented, declared a 1998 manifesto co-authored by Galston, was the power of higher ed in the way that millions of Americans are surging into the ranks of the upper middle class and wealthy. Americans were getting smart, Americans were getting rich, and therefore the Democratic Party had to become the party of the smart and the rich, of the better educated upscale voters, who wanted private retirement accounts but weren't so keen on public schools. 2. Post-ideological ideas like these soon became the common sense of the party's dominant faction. Democrats had put the New Deal behind them and remade themselves as leaders for an age of innovation and flexibility, affluence and sophistication, investment bankers and tech billionaires. When their turn in power came in 2008, new-style Democratic leaders declined to break up Wall Street banks. They delivered a version of national health insurance that, amazingly, did not inconvenience big pharma or private insurance companies. Silicon Valley executives, radiating futurific exuberance, swarmed through the Barack Obama White House and its would-be successor organization, the Hillary Clinton presidential campaign, helping usher the nation into a new golden age of cyber transformation. Right until the end, this post-ideological, learning-class fantasy ambled high-mindedly along. A month before the 2016 election, President Obama hosted South by Southlawn, a White House-specific version of the famous Texas Innovation Festival. Under a perfect October sky, Hollywood stars rubbed elbows with climate scientists while audience members, chosen in a merit-based admissions process, gazed at colorful conceptual art and heard about creative solutions for poverty and disease. The president expressed confidence, in that low-key way of his, that we would overcome global warming, because we happen to be the most innovative and dynamic business and entrepreneurial sector in the world. It was consensus liberalism's last moment of supreme self-assurance, and so unruffled was the performance that one journalistic fan was moved to dub Obama our commander-in-cool. 3. The Democratic presidential campaign, which expected to rotate Hillary Clinton smoothly into Obama's office a few months after that golden afternoon, exemplified this air of unflappable complacency. If affinity among the elites was the ultimate objective of modern politics, as Edward Shills said back in 1956, the Democrats achieved a state of nirvana that fall. Clinton's campaign not only promised consensus, it was itself an act of consensus, with seats at the table for representatives from Wall Street, Silicon Valley, and the national security apparatus. Every orthodoxy was included. For once the Democrat outraised and outspent her Republican rival. In the nation's college towns and affluent, learning-class suburbs she was acclaimed as the embodiment of inevitability. Just as in 1936, affinity among the elites included professional economists, 370 of whom signed an open letter urging people not to vote for Donald Trump. It also included the press, with journalists taking Clinton's side as a matter of learning-class solidarity. In the newspaper endorsement race, she defeated Trump overwhelmingly, winning the editorial support of 57 of the country's largest papers to Trump's 2. Of the money donated by journalists to a presidential campaign, 96% of it went to Clinton. Nearly every media polling operation asserted that Clinton would win the election easily. In October 2016, the New York Times reported that Clinton was pushing her campaign into Republican states in order to enlarge her certain landslide over the racist Trump. 4. And then on November 8 the unthinkable happened. The blowhard billionaire managed to win much of the declining industrial Midwest and with it the presidency. Shocked by the disaster, white-collar America descended into a full-blown democracy scare similar to the ones I have described in this book. Once again populism was identified as the culprit. It was the evil political spirit that made Trump possible and that haunted the nightmares of the affluent. That Trump had not, in fact, won the popular vote didn't slow this accelerating narrative. That his populism was a fraud was also unimportant. For the well-educated and the well-heeled, the old, familiar anti-populist tune became the inspirational anthem of the era. Lawrence Goodwin, the great historian of mass democratic uprisings, once wrote that to build a movement like the People's Party of the 1890s or the labor movement of the 1930s, one must connect with people as they are in society, that is to say, in a state that sophisticated modern observers are inclined to regard as one of inadequate consciousness. 5. Goodwin also warned against a politics of individual righteousness, a tendency toward celebrating the purity of one's so-called radicalism. If you wish to democratize the country's economic structure, he argued, you must practice ideological patience, a suspension of moral judgment of ordinary Americans. 6. Only then can you start to build a movement that is hopeful and powerful and that changes society forever. If you're not interested in democratizing the country's economic structure, however, individual righteousness might be just the thing for you. This model deals with ordinary citizens by judging and purging, by canceling and scolding. It's not about building, it's about purity, about stainless moral virtue. Its favorite math is subtraction. Its most cherished rhetorical form is denunciation. Its goal is to bring the core of the righteous into a tight orbit around the most righteous one of all. What swept over huge parts of American liberalism after the disaster of November 8, 2016, was the opposite of Goodwin's ideological patience. It was a paroxysm of scolding, a furor for informing Trump voters what inadequate and indeed rotten people they were. The elitist trend that had been building among liberals for decades hurried to its loud, carping consummation. Where populism is optimistic about rank-and-file voters, the variety of liberalism I have in mind regards them with a combination of suspicion and disgust. It dreams not of organizing humanity but of policing it. It is a geyser of moral rebuke, erupting against teenagers who have committed some act of cultural appropriation, against the hiring of an actor for an inappropriate role, against a public speech by someone with unpopular views, against the wrongful dumping of household trash, against inappropriate tree pruning techniques spotted in a nearby suburb. Its characteristic goal is not to get banks and monopolies under control, as populism typically does, but to set up a nonprofit, attract funding from banks and monopolies, and then to scold the world for its sins. The populists used to dream of what they called a cooperative commonwealth, but today it's a vindictive commonwealth that inspires the reformer, a utopia of scolding in which court is always in session and the righteous constantly hand down the harshest of judgments on their economic and moral inferiors. Why the ruling class must continue to rule is always the great theme of democracy scares, voiced by eminent economist and newspaper editor alike. In our own time, even comedians have a role to play in the operation. In defense of elitism, a 2019 account of the Trump era by Time magazine humorist Joel Stein describes the essential divide between liberals and Trump supporters like this. Elites are people who think, populists are people who believe. Populists are creatures of intuition and childlike impulse, people who think that facts are indistinguishable from lies. Elites accept the expertise of experts. Populism, however, is little more than a primal scream for primordial masculinity. Just as in 1896, populism is supposed to represent the appetites and vulgar urges of the body, in revolt against the higher faculties of thought and reason. 7. The idea of ordinary people having a say in matters of state is strictly a joke. In a precise replay of conservative humorists of 1896, the liberal humorist of 2019 laughs off the suggestion that farmers be represented on the sophisticated body that decides U.S. monetary policy. Imagine if farmers were involved in such decisions. Joel Stein guffaws, trying to figure out how to establish central bank liquidity swap lines during a financial crisis. What our age urgently requires, he announces, is the opposite of that. A wide-ranging acknowledgement that elites are legitimate. That meritocracy is fair. That domination is rightful when the dominant group is made up of people who, like Stein and his friends, went to name-brand colleges. If ordinary people want things to change, I suppose, they must implore the brainy to change them. After all, democracy is, as he puts it, a government of the nerds, by the nerds, and for the nerds. 8. What is especially disheartening about this defense of elitism is the author's apparent unfamiliarity with liberalism's non-elitist past, of a time when liberalism was an expression of the democratic hopes of ordinary people. Disheartening. And yet utterly typical of the resistance culture of our time, where more and more one notices a frank acknowledgement of liberalism as the politics of a highly educated upper class. 9. After all, as Hillary Clinton herself put it a year after the election was over, I won the places that represent 2/3 of America's gross domestic product. The places that are optimistic, diverse, dynamic, moving forward. What is missing from this vision of exuberant, future-minded liberalism is labor, the driving force of so many reform movements since the 1890s. One story of the Trump years that sticks with me was related to me by a high school student who went to a discussion of political issues with a group of progressive teenagers in an affluent part of the Washington, D.C. metro area. The group's leader went around the room asking the students what issues they considered significant and then getting a show of hands on the importance of each one. Racism was mentioned, and sexism, and LGBTQ issues, and gun control, and the environment. The student raised her hand and said, labor. It was, she told me, the only suggestion that drew no support at all. That's a brief incident in a tiny corner of this country, and yet it brings us to a revealing political fact of our time: the disappearance of class from the mainstream liberal agenda. All genuine populist movements have aimed to bring working people together across barriers of race, religion, and ethnicity in order to reform capitalism. This is what defines the species. Indeed, this has been one of the traditional objectives of left-wing movements since the 19th century. The prophets of reproach who make up the modern left aren't particularly interested in that, however. And once you start looking for this erasure, for this peculiar lacuna in the worldview of a certain type of liberal, you notice it everywhere. Social class is the glaring, zillion-watt absence, for example, in those anti-Trump yard signs that have become so popular in nice suburban neighborhoods, and that strain for inclusiveness. In this house, we believe. Black lives matter. Women's rights are human rights. No human is illegal. Science is real. Love is love. And kindness is everything. But that say nothing about the right to organize or to earn a living wage. Cataloging the history of American protest or disobedience has become something of a cultural set piece of the Trump era, only with one branch of that history always conspicuously left out. 10. Charles Blow, a solidly anti-Trump columnist for the New York Times, spent much of 2017 and 18 remembering different forms of historical resistance that modern-day liberals might look to for inspiration, but almost never mentioned labor unions or strikes. He name-checked Selma, Stonewall, ACT UP, Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, and the 2016 protests at Standing Rock. But largely failed to notice the one form of resistance that is an ordinary element of economic life, that happens in cities and towns across America all the time. 11. The work that really drove this home for me was A Century of Protest, a 2018 video feature produced by the New Yorker magazine that was comprised of footage of protests throughout American history. When I watched the video, after sitting through an advertisement from Prada, I saw some 58 different clips of historical footage covering everything from suffragette marches of 1913 to the big 1987 ACT UP protest, with a special emphasis on the civil rights movement, Vietnam War protests, and present-day Black Lives Matter confrontations. Communists and even the Ku Klux Klan were represented in this all-inclusive roll call of protest. But mainstream organized labor was not. In this version of history there is evidently no room for the AFL-CIO's enormous 1981 Solidarity Day rally on the National Mall, or for the Flint sit-down strike, or for the Memphis sanitation workers, or for red-shirted teachers in Arizona. The old WPA mural has been airbrushed over. Asterisk of course, there were no motion picture cameras on hand to record the get-togethers of the populists, but other farmer protest movements, for example, the farm holiday strike of 1932 or the nationwide tractorcade of 1979, were lavishly photographed, and yet they, too, are always overlooked in documentaries of this kind. One explanation for this omission, no doubt, is the much commented upon defection of white, working-class voters from the Democratic Party to Trump's Republicans. For a certain kind of Democratic partisan, this development has had the predictable consequence of rendering unsayable anything that smacks of traditional class grievances. Talk about the deindustrialization of vast parts of the country, the decimation of unions, the destruction of small towns by monopoly forces, and this kind of person hears, Trump voter. The enlightened liberal shuns such people. They are to be scolded, not championed. Then there is the straightforward element of class. When affluent suburban lawns advertise a form of liberalism that has been cleansed of solidarity with workers, the self-interest of the gesture is obvious. When a history of protest is sponsored by a luxury fashion company, the results are, as they say in France, overdetermined. This pattern of erasure has muddled liberal conversation on economic issues for years. Take the critical matter of trade. On the campaign trail in 2016, Donald Trump made a point of loudly, if incoherently, criticizing the nation's trade agreements, deals that had been strongly opposed by labor unions but also happened to be the proud, defining achievement of the global-minded centrist wing of the Democratic Party. Trump was obviously using the issue to drive a wedge between the Democrats and one of their biggest constituent groups. At the time, however, liberal pundits pretty much ignored the matter. Once Trump had won, a panicked pundit bureau swung into action, insisting in a crescendo of consensus that trade had little to do with the country's deindustrialization, that it was pretty much all due to technological factors. That what happened to manufacturing workers was therefore unavoidable. After the dust had settled, many commentators changed their mind on this question, quietly acknowledging the disastrous consequences of ill-crafted trade deals. But what matters for our purposes is the initial reaction, which was virtually unanimous and unfolded along the same lines as in 1896. The rationality of working-class grievances had to be denied. 12. The outcome of the 2016 election, the same pundit bureau insisted, could not and must not be explained by reference to economic factors or to long-term, class-related trends. Yes, lots of Trump voters said they were motivated by economic concerns. Yes, Trump talked about economic issues all the time. And yes, the economic stagnation of Trump voting areas is obvious to anyone who has gone there. And also, every time our post-partisan liberal leaders deregulated banks and then turned around and told working-class people that their misfortunes were attributable to their poor education. Every time they did this and then thought to themselves, they have nowhere else to go, they made the Trump disaster a little more likely. But to acknowledge those plain facts was to come dangerously close to voicing the intolerable heresy that the DC opinion cartel dubbed the economic anxiety thesis. The idea that people voted for Trump out of understandable worries about wages or opioids or unemployment or deindustrialization. The reason this was intolerable, one suspects, is because it suggested that there was a rational element to certain groups' support for Trump and also that there was something less than a plus about the professional class Camelot over which the Democrats presided for 8 years. Just as in 1896, the rationality of certain low-class voters was ruled out from the start. My point here is not to suggest that Trump is a very stable genius, as he likes to say, or that he led a genuine populist insurgency. In my opinion, he isn't and he didn't. Populism is the same as ever. The lower orders, it insists, are driven by irrationality, bigotry, authoritarianism, and hate. Democracy is a problem because it gives such people a voice. The difference today is that enlightened liberals are the ones mouthing this age-old anti-populist catechism. In 1966, after losing a race for a California state Senate seat, the political prankster Dick Tuck went on TV to concede and griped, "The people have spoken, the bastards." Today the humor behind Tuck's legendary line is not so funny. Rebuking the people for delivering awkward election results became a serious, mainstream exercise after 2016. I mean by this something distinct from the social science worries about populism that I discussed in the introduction. This was a red-hot moral rebuke of the millions. America was a wicked land and its people were bastards. Racists, sexists, facilitators of evil who actually deserved the post-industrial and opioid-saturated bleakness of their red state lives. Asterisk here is an actual headline of a Daily Kos story that ran about a month after the 2016 election. Be happy for coal miners losing their health insurance. They're getting exactly what they voted for. It started with Hillary Clinton's disastrous decision while campaigning in September 2016 to describe certain Trump supporters as deplorables and irredeemables because they were racist, sexist, homophobic, and so on. Clinton, of course, was a practicing politician. She realized her blunder immediately and clarified that her dispute was with Trump himself and not the rank-and-file American. Mainstream liberal commentators, on the other hand, never looked back. Resentment is no excuse for bald-faced stupidity, was Garrison Keillor's assessment of the results, published in the Washington Post 2 days after the election. If working people were no longer moving upward in life, he continued, they had only themselves to blame. Maybe they should encourage good habits, and make sure the kids aren't plugged into electronics day and night, instead of whooping it up for the candidate of cruelty and ignorance. In an essay published a few days later, Slate columnist Jamel Bouie suggested that it was morally grotesque to insist Trump's backers are good people. The instantly famous title of his effort was, There's Number Such Thing as a Good Trump Voter. His subtitle declared, They Don't Deserve Your Empathy. Writing in the Boston Globe a month later, NYU professor Charles Taylor insisted that Trump voters should feel shame for their ignorance. Republicans believed all manner of falsehoods, he thundered, and still this imperviousness to fact pales next to the racism and xenophobia and misogyny. In other words, the moral ignorance that Trump's supporters wallowed in. As the ignominy of Trump's supporters expanded, the saintliness of his vanquished opponent gleamed ever brighter. Writing in The Guardian the week after the election, the literary scholar Sarah Churchwell insisted that what happened in November 2016 was in no way attributable to any shortcoming of Hillary Clinton. It is time to stop suggesting that Clinton failed us, she announced. The truth is, we failed her. In not electing Clinton president, the people themselves had fallen short. None of these were the views of radicals. Each of these statements, and I chose these from hundreds of similar expressions of moral disgust, was the product of a reputable writer or high-ranking academic, published or broadcast by an established news outlet. It was our country's best-informed opinionators who were most determined to believe in the essential monstrousness of tens of millions of their fellow citizens. Why did these liberals adopt this ferociously anti-populist line so quickly? There were many conventional explanations for Trump's catastrophic win other than the general wickedness of the American people. Surely some role was played by Trump's stand on trade and his rhetorical commitment to social insurance programs, both highly unusual positions for a Republican, which might have made voters more willing to take a chance on him than they would have on, say, Mitt Romney. There were his promises of populist-style reform, none of them sincere, but which sometimes sounded genuinely good. I mean, who doesn't despise the power structure? Who doesn't want to drain the swamp of Washington? Who doesn't want their mortgaged farm or their post-industrial town or their crumbling neighborhood to be made great again? 13. But acknowledging that some Trump voters might be desperate and otherwise decent people became a thing unsayable in the small world of America's opinion class. The total depravity of those people was the only acceptable explanation. Hillary Clinton had used the word irredeemable to describe some Trump voters, and her moralistic judgment far outlived her campaign. Trump's rise was not about politics, it was about sin, and it was the task of progressives to scold the unrighteous for their iniquity. Asterisk the exceptions to this tend to prove the rule. In early 2017, the liberal New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof began urging his readers to show empathy toward certain kinds of Trump voters, specifically the marginal ones who were struggling with difficult economic situations. Tolerance is a liberal value, Kristof reminded his audience. A few weeks later, the columnist recounted the outpouring of rage he had received since making this suggestion, writing that, nothing I've written since the election has engendered more anger from people who usually agree with me than my periodic assertions that Trump voters are human, too. To scold, and conspicuously withhold forgiveness. In what was surely the strangest Trump-era fad of them all, various high-minded progressive commentators announced that they so hated the world that they were never, ever going to absolve those who had trespassed politically against them. Reasoning in 2019 that conservatives spat in our face and elected an abusive, racist, misogynist criminal, the author and blogger Amanda Marcotte advised against forgiving rank-and-file Republican voters. Should liberals just let matters slide as we had allegedly done with people who voted for George W. Bush, she asked rhetorically, or should progressives impose social consequences, declining friendships and putting a chill on family relationships, in order to send the message that supporting Trump was not okay and will not be shrugged off as a harmless lark? Blacklisting was one of the weapons to which this ferocious moral crusade inevitably turned. First, liberal thought leaders called upon private businesses to shun Trump administration employees when those worthies left government for the private sector. Then, at almost exactly the same time, centrist Democrats tried to deploy this powerful new weapon against the party's left wing, with the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee announcing that it would refuse to do business with any political consultancies that worked for challengers to Democratic incumbents. 14. Neither of these episodes, let us note, was an attempt to stop Washington's notorious revolving door, only to prevent certain kinds of people from passing through it. To be sure, I have no sympathy for Trump officials who are prevented from cashing in after their service is completed. What I find shocking is how comfortable liberals have become with the weapons of the boss. A minor yet telling illustration of this newfound comfort came up a few years ago when Lena Dunham, a much celebrated TV star who spoke at the 2016 Democratic Convention, happened to be delayed in an airport somewhere. While wandering the concourses, Dunham decided to contact corporate management and turn in some airline employees she thought she overheard making transphobic remarks, and doing all of it on social media, so the whole world could admire her as she snitched. "At this moment in history we should be teaching our employees about love and inclusivity," she tweeted. I was struck by that "our employees" line. Not only did Dunham take for granted that her followers had employees, but that employment is a relationship in which love and inclusivity are handed down by bosses to workers. Needless to say, Dunham was applauded for her action. Teen Vogue opined that it's important to recognize the importance of standing up to transphobia. 15. Indeed it is. But might there have been a different way to go about it, a way that showed more ideological patience? I can't help but think that Dunham would have achieved a better result had she actually introduced herself to the transphobic people in person and talked it over with them. Urging a boss to punish a worker for an overheard remark is the kind of officiousness that people sometimes resent. A celebrated study published in 2016 showed that talking to someone about their prejudice against trans people was an effective method for reducing that prejudice. See David Brookman and Joshua Kalla, Durably Reducing Transphobia, Science 352, number 6282, April 8, 2016, 220-24. Similarly, scolding people for having morally obtuse politics may be the very worst way to get them to change those politics. As of this writing, Trump voters have remained remarkably loyal to the man they chose in 2016, far more loyal than voters for other politicians who, like Trump, turned out to be incompetent or corrupt. One reason for this stubbornness, I suspect, is the constant hailstorm of rebuke and shame that has been directed against those voters from on high for the last 4 years. In other words, the scolding style may actually have served to confirm them in their dreadful choice rather than to persuade them to move away from it. 16. What is certain is that the liberalism of scolding will never give rise to the kind of mass movement that this country needs. It is almost entirely a politics of individual righteousness, an angry refusal of good ones, ideological patience. Its appeal comes not from the prospect of democratizing the economy but from the psychic satisfaction of wagging a finger in some stupid proletarian's face, forever. What these examples show us is a generation of centrist liberals collectively despairing over democracy itself. After turning their backs on working-class issues, traditionally one of the core concerns of left parties, Democrats stood by while right-wing demagoguery took root and thrived. Then, after the people absorbed a 50-year blizzard of fake populist propaganda, Democrats turned against the idea of the people altogether. 17. America was founded with the phrase, "We the people," but William Galston, co-inventor of the concept of the learning class, urges us to get over our obsession with popular sovereignty. As he writes in Anti-Pluralism, his 2018 attack on populism, we should set aside this narrow and complacent conviction. There are viable alternatives to the people as sources of legitimacy. 18. There certainly are. In the pages of this book, we have seen anti-populists explain that they deserve to rule because they are better educated, or wealthier, or more rational, or harder working. The contemporary culture of constant moral scolding is in perfect accordance with this way of thinking. It is a new iteration of the old elitist fantasy. The liberal establishment I am describing in this chapter is anti-populist not merely because it dislikes Donald Trump, who is in no way a genuine populist, but because it is populism's opposite in nearly every particular. Its political ambition for the people is not to bring them together in a reform movement but to scold them, to shame them, and to teach them to defer to their superiors. It doesn't seek to punish Wall Street or Silicon Valley. Indeed, the same bunch that now rebukes and cancels and blacklists could not find a way to punish elite bankers after the global financial crisis back in 2009. This liberalism desires to merge with these institutions of private privilege, to enlist their power for what it imagines to be good. The wealthy liberal neighborhoods of America have become utopias of scolding because scolding is how this kind of concentrated power relates to ordinary citizens. This isn't working-class authoritarianism, it's the opposite. Those people on top, this kind of liberalism says, they have more than you because they deserve to have more than you. Those fine people dominate you because they are better than you. Perhaps the most lasting distinction between populism and its opposite is one of mood. Populism was and is relentlessly optimistic, about people, about political possibilities, about life, and about America in general. Anti-populism is all about despair. Its attitude toward ordinary humans is bitter. Its hope for human redemption is nil. Its vision of the common good is bleak. Its dark mood gives us books with titles like In Defense of Elitism and Against Democracy. Its darkest moments of all come when it contemplates climate change. I have in mind a much-discussed op-ed the New York Times ran in December 2018, some 2 years after the election of Donald Trump shredded the tidy worldview of the learning class. The article I'm thinking of was not a political statement per se, but the philosophy professor who wrote it, Todd May, is a well-known anti-Trump activist on the campus where he teaches. To me, his essay's appearance on the nation's most prominent liberal op-ed page felt like a political act, like the final verdict of a dejected elite on a stubborn population that refuses to heed its admonitions, that revels in falsehoods and that persistently chooses ridiculous demagogues over responsible experts. May's subject is human extinction, whether it should happen or whether it shouldn't. The professor phrases his indictment of mankind with a certain delicacy, but it's impossible to miss his point. We are a harmful species, he charges, causing unimaginable suffering to many of the animals that inhabit the earth. He names climate change and factory farming as the worst of our trespasses, and declares that, if this were all to the story, there would be no tragedy. The elimination of the human species would be a good thing, full stop. But there are other considerations, the professor admits. People do some worthwhile things. Also, it would be cruel to demand of currently existing humans that they should end their lives. May's answer, ultimately, is to have it both ways. It may well be, then, that the extinction of humanity would make the world better off and yet would be a tragedy. This kind of highbrow pessimism, this barely concealed longing for the death of the species, is an attitude you come across all the time these days in enlightened liberal circles. 19. It is the inevitable flip side of the moralistic politics I have described in this chapter. The wages for our sins, the recompense for our irredeemable stupidity. Every time I encounter sentiments like these in this abattoir of idealism known as Washington, my mind goes back to my old city of Chicago, to a noisy and rusty and callous place that no one is ever sentimental about but where I like to remember how ordinary Americans used to live their lives, concerned with work and play and maybe getting ahead someday. I think of Carl Sandburg, the 20th century's poet of the people, a man who saw no contradiction between human sin and human life. And I think of Sandburg's Chicago, the greatest populist poem of them all, which acknowledges the town's vulgarity, all its tawdry sins. They tell me you were wicked. They tell me you were crooked. They tell me you were brutal. All charges that are as true today as they were in 1914. But Chicago is not an anthem of scolding. It is a rejection of scolding. It's a song about loving life despite it all, loving the life of the people, even in the midst of all the grinding industrialized awfulness. Under the smoke, dust all over his mouth, laughing with white teeth. Under the terrible burden of destiny, laughing as a young man laughs. Laughing even as an ignorant fighter laughs who has never lost a battle. Bragging and laughing that under his wrist is the pulse, and under his ribs the heart of the people. Laughing. Conclusion. The question. The story of populism and anti-populism is a dialectic of hope and cynicism. We have seen how a party of democratic inclusion chose to remodel itself as the expression of an elite consensus, and how a party of concentrated private power started passing itself off as a down-home friend of ordinary Americans. This historic inversion, so bizarre when you step back and think about it, has had precisely the effects that you would expect it to have. The legatees of Thomas Jefferson, lukewarm in all things, no longer really believe their own founding philosophy. The hard-eyed heirs of the robber barons, meanwhile, have swiped the democratic vocabulary of their enemies, and between these two parties the greatest democracy in the world has become a paradise for the privileged. But there is light at the bottom of this vortex. Today, both elite liberalism and right-wing demagoguery stand before us utterly discredited. The fraudulence of the right's bait and switch is so plain it feels like a waste of space even to describe it. Instead of redeeming our communities and taking down the elites, as the Republicans promised, they found yet more ways to make the rich richer. Instead of draining the swamp, they have given us government by lobbyist, government by polluter, government by general. Under the stupid, swaggering leadership of our current commander-in-chief, it is not just the executive branch in Washington that has been corrupted, it is all of us. Lying is normal. Trump has taught us. It is natural for officeholders to line their pockets. Incompetence at the top is the American way. Justice is for the wealthy. Bigotry is no big deal. Money and power are the only things that matter. The exhaustion of centrist, post-partisan liberalism is just as obvious. The disappointing experience of the Obama years made it clear that the ruling clique of the Democratic Party lacks the fortitude to confront the plutocratic onslaught of the last few decades. Even the most high-scoring meritocrats, we learned, will not take on the hierarchy to which they owe their exalted status. The technocratic faction's other selling point, that they alone can check the rightward-charging Republicans, lies in a million pieces on the floor after 2016. Not even when the GOP backed the least competent and most unpopular presidential candidate of all time could the Democrats' consensus-minded leaders defeat him. A joyless politics of reprimand is all that centrism has left. A politics of individual righteousness that regards the public not as a force to be organized but as a thread to be scolded and disciplined. Unfortunately, it is an ineffective politics in addition to an unhappy one. Plutocracy will go on even if we were to cleanse Twitter of every last problematic participant. Healthcare will still be unaffordable even after the pundits manage to shame every last resentful Trump voter into silence. As a vehicle of reform, this species of liberalism is useless. There is another way, reader. As we have learned in these pages, there is a tradition that trusts in the people, that responds to their needs, that turns resentment into progress. That same populist tradition is and has always been at war with monopoly, with corporate authority, with billionaire privilege, with inequality. It insists and has always insisted that too few people control too much of the money and power, as the modern day. Texas populist Jim Hightower described it to me. Indeed, you can't really have the second part of the formula, the war on concentrated economic power, without the first part, a broad-minded acceptance of average people. That is because the only real answer to plutocracy is a mass movement of ordinary working people, hailing from all different backgrounds, brought together by a common desire to dismantle the forces that make their toil so profitless and to figure out how they might gain control over their lives. The demand for economic democracy is how you build a mass movement of ordinary people. And a mass movement of ordinary people, in turn, is how you achieve economic democracy. Which is to say that the answer both to Trumpist fraud and to liberal elitism must come from us, from the democratic public itself. As I write these words, under semi-quarantine due to the coronavirus pandemic, I can't help but think of the lives and livelihoods that a people-oriented healthcare system might have saved. As our endless wars drag on, I think of the road not taken, of what Bayard Rustin and his colleagues called the Freedom Budget, their proposal for a massive enlargement of the New Deal and the Great Society that would have ended unemployment while securing proper housing and healthcare for everyone. It was, in a sense, what all of the movements I have described here were ultimately after, the great unachieved goal of American populism. In his foreword to the 1967 booklet introducing the Freedom Budget, Martin Luther King wrote that, "We shall eliminate slums for Negroes when we destroy ghettos and build new cities for all. We shall eliminate unemployment for Negroes when we demand full and fair employment for all. We shall produce an educated and skilled Negro mass when we achieve a 20th century educational system for all, when this is not an idle dream." We know what genuine populism looks like. We have seen it crop up in the agrarian 1890s, in the New Deal 1930s, in the civil rights days of the 1960s. Let me relate one final tale of democracy's promise. It's a story that starts with the appeal to reason, the legendary Kansas newspaper that began life as a supporter of the People's Party before transferring its allegiance to the Socialists. Years later, as socialism followed populism into oblivion, the remaining editor of the Appeal to Reason, a child of Jewish immigrants named Emanuel Haldeman Julius, cast about looking for ways to rescue the sinking publishing operation. The idea he eventually hit upon in 1919 owed much to the old populist traditions of pamphleteering and mass popular education, left-wing essays, famous works of literature, and self-education tracts printed up in pocket-sized form and priced so low, 5 cents, that virtually anyone could afford them. He was born Emanuel Julius, but in 1916, when he married Marcette Haldeman, also a writer of note, they merged their surnames. The People's Pocket series, he called them, before eventually changing the name to the Little Blue Books. You could buy them from vending machines in railroad stations. You could get 20 titles for $1, post-paid from Girard, Kansas. They were great books for the common man, a bridge between the agrarian radicalism of the 1890s and the labor radicalism of the 1930s. The Little Blue Books, Haldeman Julius once wrote, represented a democracy of literature, in which the highest of highbrow culture was made available to anyone who wanted it. They were not meant to be showy. Their covers were unpretentious, their paper was coarse and uneven. Yet this flatly proletarian business model was an overwhelming success. 10 years after launching his cheapskate publishing empire, Haldeman Julius had sold 100 million of the Little Books. By 1951, the year he died, there were some 2,500 different titles in his warehouse in Kansas. The grand total of Little Blue Books sold came to 500 million. 2. The books themselves are relics of an age when tramps read Zola and dirt farmers wanted to know about Goethe and every village had an atheist who could quote Tom Paine or Robert Ingersoll. Scan the biographical literature on Haldeman Julius and you will find testimonials from people who read Little Blue Books while on strike or while in prison, people who read them on the subway train, people who passed them around in hospitals and at boarding houses. Haldeman Julius's idea was not to reinforce hierarchies of taste but to demolish them, to put all books on the same level, as he once wrote. The door to learning and culture has been forced open, proclaimed one of his ads from the 1920s. The plain blue booklets were not intended to decorate shelves but to enrich minds, announced another. 3. The historian Christopher Lasch once famously declared that the professions came into being by reducing the layman to incompetence. Haldeman Julius's idea was to do the opposite, to undermine elites by making ordinary people capable. The Little Blue Books were emphatically about the intelligence of the self-taught American, about their ability to read Ibsen and Balzac on their own, about their power to undertake complicated projects by themselves. How to psychoanalyze your neighbors. How to be a gate crasher, airplanes and how to fly them. How to make your own cosmetics. How to acquire good taste. How to be a modern mother. How to become a writer of little blue books. How to build your own greenhouse, and here, have a shot of Schopenhauer while you're building it. The big idea behind the enterprise, Haldeman Julius wrote, was to put an end to cultural, intellectual, economic and political subservience and inferiority. There are men, rich and powerful, who shudder at the thought of a free world, free thinking, free living, sane behavior, mass health and happiness, individual freedom and social responsibility, the right to candid speech on any possible subject. They live on lies. I don't merely disapprove of them. I more than dislike them. I hate them with an implacable hatred. 4. This form of populism was no celebration of ignorance. It was a one-man campaign against the falsehoods of the mighty, against racism and intolerance, against organized religion, against superstition, against conventional interpretations of history, against orthodoxy of every kind. For our purposes, though, it is Haldeman Julius's campaign against racism that means the most. Several little blue books dealt with the Klan, which was generating great clouds of toxic nonsense in the 20s. In one of these, Haldeman Julius described the Klan as a viper, a beast, a spreader of poison, bigotry, and reaction. Asterisk in 1927 his wife, Marcette Haldeman Julius, authored one of the most striking little blue books of them all, an original account of a lynching in Little Rock, Arkansas, written so soon after the event that it reads like first-hand reportage. As the awful story unfolds, she interviews the people involved and describes the scenes in brutal detail, the cowardice of the city officials, the insane vindictiveness of the white population, the members of the mob who aren't ashamed of what they've done. 5. Asterisk on a happier note, the Little Blue Book series also carried important contributions from W.E.B. Du Bois and NAACP leader Walter F. White, whose 1928 study of the Harlem Renaissance was published under the title The Negro's Contribution to American Culture, the Sudden Flowering of a Genius-Laden Artistic Movement. The publisher was optimistic about the prospects for his campaign of enlightenment. Science, he believed, was slowly pushing back the tyranny of bunk, loosening the grip of aristocracy and superstition. But there was an important caveat, for all his admiration of learning and science. Haldeman Julius did not celebrate intellectual elites. One of Haldeman Julius's titles might have been the motto for his entire operation, the dumbness of the great. What made our age of enlightenment so wonderful, he argued, was that it promised to disseminate greatness among all the people. Experts may insist on the incompetence of the layman, but this Kansan aimed for something more democratic. Freedom and inquiry and brilliance could not be the property of some tiny clique. It is the common man who has, by revolution and by the broader evolution of a new kind of civilization, been endowed with the rights of personality. 6. What Haldeman Julius was fighting was a war that was simultaneously against elitism and in favor of science and culture. This is contrary to everything we have been told populism stands for. It's contrary to the way we believe civilization works. Science and culture are supposed to be about rank and prestige. They're the property of the learning class. And here are these coarse-grained booklets from Girard, Kansas, telling us exactly the opposite. That everyone has the spark of the divine. This is populism in its best form. I mean this not just politically, and not just in terms of Haldeman Julius's forthright contempt for elites and racism and mob rule, but also in his simultaneous faith in the common man, his love for learning, and his guileless praise for Voltaire and Paine and Debs and Darrow. 7. The last point I want to make is this: populism wins. Not only is populism the classic, all-American response to hierarchy and plutocracy, but it is also the naturally dominant rhetorical element in our political tradition. I make this claim even though the populists themselves didn't get what they were after for many decades, even though the labor movement in the 30s never organized the South, even though Martin Luther King never saw the freedom budget enacted into law. Still, populism has a power that technocracy and liberal scolding and Trumpist bullshit do not, because populism is deep in the grain of the democratic personality. Americans do not defer to their social superiors. We are natural-born egalitarians. Populism is the word that gets at our incurable itch to deflate pretentiousness of every description. In political contests in most parts of America, the candidate who captures this refusal of deference is, more often than not, the candidate who wins. This is a crude and sweeping simplification, but nevertheless it is usually true. Understood the way I have defined it, populist protest against the economic elite is what made the Democrats the majority party for so many decades. Another reason we know that anti-elitism works is because we have seen it working against us for 50 years. The Republican Party owes its successful hold on power to adopting, you might say, stealing, the anti-elitist themes I have described. From the days of Nixon to those of Trump, the conservative revolution happened not because Americans love polluters and disease but because Republicans sold themselves as a party of protest against the elite. Most of the time it was the cultural elite that was the target, the prideful people who make movies and write newspapers, who love blasphemy but hate the flag. The point is so easy and so obvious that it's hard to understand why it's been so difficult for Democratic politicians to get it. Populism is the supreme rhetorical weapon in the arsenal of American politics. On the other hand, the impulse to identify your goals with the elite, with any elite, even a moral one, is a kind of political death wish. In a democracy, a faction that chooses to go about its business by admiring its own moral goodness and scolding average voters as insensitive clods is a faction that is not interested in winning. But we are learning, thanks to insurgent campaigns like the one mounted by Bernie Sanders for the presidency in 2016, we know fairly precisely what a modern-day populism looks like. It would focus, of course, on economic reforms, ambitious ones, not technocratic fine-tuning. It would aim to put those reforms on the national agenda not by the strength of one candidate's popularity but by bringing together a movement of working people, by mobilizing millions of people who don't vote and don't participate and don't ordinarily have a say. It would be financed almost entirely by small individual contributions, in the classic Fred Harris manner. And it would aim to enlist millions of embittered voters, Republican voters, even, with far-reaching proposals of the kind we haven't heard for many years. Universal health care, no more grotesque student debt, banking reform, a war on monopolies, a reimagining of our trade policy. This is not just a plan to win the presidency. As Sanders himself used to say, it is a blueprint for political revolution, a complete reversal of the direction in which the country has been traveling for decades. And the key to making it work is movement building on a massive scale, enlisting millions of ordinary people who have lost their faith in democracy. Another man who understands this is the Reverend William Barber II, the North Carolina pastor who is building a modern-day poor people's campaign designed to pick up where Martin Luther King's effort left off back in 1968. Barber's plan is to organize poor people from every imaginable background with an eye to pulling together another unstoppable mass movement. As with other populist efforts I have described, it is the people themselves who provide the leadership. As Barber himself puts it, the impacted people, poor people, are at the center of the leadership. We're not doing some kind of social service for them. They have to be a part of setting the policies. They have to be part of the critique. Therefore we build a stage for their voice, not for ours alone. It is an idea whose time has obviously come, and the place it must come first is the Democratic Party. The party of technocrats and consultants, of calculating triangulators and fans of the smoke-filled rooms, must eventually give way to the populism that we must have. Thus will the Democratic Party learn once again to breathe hope into those who despair. The populism I am describing is not formless anger that might lash out in any direction. It is not racism. It is not resentment. It is not demagoguery. It is, instead, to ask the most profound question of them all. For whom does America exist? I take that question from the culture critic Gilbert Seldes, who saw it as the great unanswered demand of the 1890s populist revolt. The question was raised again in 1936, the year when Seldes wrote those words. It came up again in the 1960s. And here we are, asking it again today. 8. For whom does America exist? Its billionaires? Its celebrities? Its tech companies? Are we the people just a laboring, sweating instrument for the bonanza paydays of our betters? Are we just glorified security guards, obeying orders to protect their holdings? Are we nothing more than a vast test market to be tracked and probed and hopefully sold on airline tickets, fast food, or Hollywood movies featuring some awesome new animation technology? Or is it the other way around? Are they supposed to serve us? Let us resolve to ask that far-reaching question again. For whom does America exist? This time around, there can be only one possible answer.